My name is Beverly Bishop, and at 69 years old, I have learned that the most dangerous people rarely raise their voices. They smile. They ask soft questions. They wait. They let you fill the silence yourself, and then they use what you put in it. I think of this now because 5 days after my son's wedding, a black Mercedes I did not recognize came up my gravel driveway and parked beside my old Volvo like it had been coming there for years. It was a Thursday in the middle of May. I remember the heat had not arrived yet, and the mornings still had a knife in them, and I had been out since 8, cutting back the rose bushes that Norman and I planted on our 10th anniversary, the ones along the south fence that he always said would never take, and that took anyway the way most things did when he put his hands on them. The passenger door opened first. Out stepped Dana, my new daughter-in-law, in a white pantsuit that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a year. Then the driver's door opened, and a man I had never seen in my life got out with a leather briefcase and the careful, neutral expression of a person who bills by the hour. My son Brock was nowhere in sight. I stood there in my gardening gloves with dirt worked up under the nails. 69 years old, 5 days into being somebody's mother-in-law, and something cold turned over in my stomach. I want to be honest with you from the beginning, because this whole story is about what happens when people are not. The cold thing in my stomach was not surprise. I had been waiting for that car for 6 months. I had been waiting for it the way you wait for a diagnosis you have already read the symptoms of, and if I had done 1 or 2 things differently in those 6 months, it would never have come up my driveway at all. So before I tell you what happened on my porch that afternoon, I need to take you back. Back to the man who built everything they came to take. Back to a young woman who was drowning in a way I did not understand until much too late. And back most of all to the reasons I had already trained myself to keep my mouth shut about money reasons I believed were wisdom, and which turned out in the places where it mattered most to be the exact mechanism of the harm. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about protecting the people you love with silence. Silence does not know who it is protecting. It just sits there in the middle of a family patient as a stone, and it works on everybody in the room equally. I was a pediatric nurse for 31 years. You spend 3 decades reading the faces of frightened children and the faces of the adults who bring them in, and something happens to your hearing. It sharpens in one specific direction. You learn the difference between a real answer and a rehearsed one. A real answer comes out crooked. It starts in the wrong place. It doubles back. It contains a detail that does nobody any good, like the color of the rug or what was on television. A rehearsed answer is clean. It arrives in order. It anticipates the next question and answers that too before you have asked it. He fell off the top bunk. He was climbing on the dresser, and he slipped. He was running in the kitchen, and he went down on the corner of the table. Some of those were true. I was wrong plenty of times in both directions, and I have carried a few of those wrong calls for 40 years. But I want you to understand when I tell you that something in Dana rang false to me from the first evening that I am not a suspicious old woman inventing a villain to make her life interesting. I simply know what a rehearsed answer sounds like. I have heard several thousand of them. It is a sound like a drawer sliding shut. What I did not know then, what I would not understand for the better part of a year, is that a person can rehearse an answer because she is lying, and she can rehearse an answer because she has been made so afraid that the truth is not available to her. From the outside in the moment in a woman's living room over coffee, those 2 things sound identical. That is the whole trouble with instinct. Mine told me exactly where to look. It could not tell me what I was looking at. My husband Norman and I were married 41 years. Most people in our town knew him as the quiet man who built Bishop freight lines out of one second-hand truck with a bad transmission into a refrigerated hauling company with 40 rigs and 6 cold storage warehouses across 3 states. Almost nobody knew the size of what he had built, and that was precisely how he wanted it. The story I had about Norman for most of our marriage, the one he gave me early and never corrected, was that he grew up poor in a mill town in Michigan, the son of a factory man, and that he left school at 19 to go to work when his father's health failed. He would only ever say that his family had once had a little and then had nothing, and that the having and the losing had both happened faster than anyone expected. I want you to hold on to that sentence because I held on to it for 41 years and I had it wrong the entire time. And the day I finally learned what he actually meant by it, I had to sit down in a little windowless room at a bank and put my hand over my mouth. Money is a tool, he used to tell me, not an identity. Flash it around and you invite the wrong kind of people to your door. I wrote that off for decades as the caution of a man who had grown up without. Poor boys who make money often stay strange about it. They clip coupons, they save rubber bands, they cannot bring themselves to pay somebody else to mow the lawn. I thought Norman was one of those. I thought it was a lovable eccentricity, and I teased him about it. And once at my sister's kitchen table, I called it a small mind about money, and he did not speak to me for a day and a half. I understand now that it was not caution, and it was not smallness. It was a warning he had already paid for in full, delivered every day for 4 decades to a wife who kept hearing it as a personality trait. We lived in the same 4-bedroom house we bought the year Brock was born. We drove sensible cars. We took 1 vacation a year, usually somewhere within a tank of gas, and we put nearly everything back into the business. When a national logistics chain offered Norman $50 million for the company, 3 years before he got sick, he took it, moved it carefully with our financial advisor Dale Brooks, and went right on cutting coupons out of the Sunday Circular for the store brand of coffee. Brock grew up understanding the value of work and never once understanding the size of what his parents had. That was deliberate. It was the central project of Norman's fatherhood. "I want him to find the shape of his own life," Norman said to me once standing at the sink. "If he knows what's behind him, he'll never find out what's in him." I agreed with him. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to tell this story as though my husband made a decision and I went along with it. I did not go along with it. I believed it. I sat in that kitchen and nodded and thought, yes, that is exactly right. That is how you raise a man. We were not wrong either. That is the part that still snags on me. We were not wrong. We were just so entirely certain that we never once asked what it would cost or who would end up paying it or what happens to a person who is loved by 2 people who have decided on his behalf, and without telling him that there are rooms in his own life he is not allowed to enter. Brock did exactly what his father hoped. He found his own shape. He became a veterinarian. He runs a small practice on the north end of town called Birchwood Animal Care in a squat brick building with a birch tree out front that is not actually a birch, and he knows every dog in a 4-mile radius by name, and half the owners cry in his exam room, and he has never once charged anybody for the box of tissues. He is the kind of vet who will call you at 9 at night to tell you the blood work came back fine because he knows you did not sleep the night before. He is the kind of vet who lets a woman on a fixed income pay him in installments of $11 and then quietly forgets to send the last 4 notices. Norman could not have been prouder if the boy had cured something. When the heart attack took my husband 18 months ago after a stroke the winter before had already taken some of his words and most of his right hand, Brock sat on one side of the hospital bed and I sat on the other. Norman had a good hour that last afternoon, one of those cruel bright windows that makes you think you have more time. He held my wrist with the hand that still worked. "Take care of our boy," he said, "but make him stand on his own feet." Those were the last clear words my husband said to me, and I have turned them over so many times since that they have gone smooth like a stone in a pocket. I obeyed them exactly. I obeyed them the way you obey a rule instead of a person, which is to say without ever asking what the man who made the rule would have wanted in a situation he did not live to see. After the funeral, I sat down with Dale Brooks and our attorney Patricia Hale and learned the full shape of what Norman had left. Between the sale of the company, the investments, the life insurance, and the 6 warehouses we still leased out, I had inherited $38 million. Brock had a trust of $1 million that would mature when he turned 35, which was 2 years away. He knew about that trust Norman had told him at 21, and had framed it brilliantly as a modest thing, a little something from your grandfather's side enough to be a cushion, and not enough to be a hammock. Brock had never asked a follow-up question in 12 years. That is my son exactly. Norman had structured all of it so that I and only I held the decisions. For a long time, the money meant nothing to me at all. I wandered the house in his bathrobe. I watched home videos of a Christmas in 1998 until my eyes burned and the tape wore a stripe down the middle of the picture. Brock came by 3 times a week and called me every single evening at 7 to make sure I had eaten something that wasn't crackers. I was 33 then. Single. A little lonely if I am honest, though he never used that word in front of me, and I never used it in front of him, which is its own quiet indictment of how we did things in that family. He had his animals and a small circle of friends and a standing Thursday poker game with 4 men who were as bad at poker as he was. I sometimes worried he would end up alone. I never said so. We were raised in my family and in his to let people choose their own road and to keep your commentary behind your teeth. And then 6 months ago at a charity gala for an animal rescue in the ballroom of a hotel downtown, my careful, methodical son met a woman named Dana Mercer. I need to tell you what Dana did for a living, and I need you to actually hear it, because when Brock first said it to me, I heard nothing at all. She was 30. She worked in fundraising. That is what he said. She works in fundraising, Mom. Development for a hospital foundation. Here is what that means. A development officer is the person a nonprofit sends to get to know its wealthy donors. It is a real profession, an honorable one in most hands, and it has real tools. Chief among them is a thing called wealth screening software that takes a name and runs it against property records, business filings, SEC disclosures, boat and aircraft registrations, political donations, obituaries, court records, and the archived business pages of every local newspaper in the country, and gives you back a number, not a guess. A range with a confidence rating and a suggested ask. Dana spent her working life learning to the dollar how much strangers were worth and learning how to make those strangers feel deeply and personally understood while she did it. She was good at her job. I want to say that plainly because later on people wanted me to describe her as a bad woman who did a bad thing, and I have never been able to make the sentence come out that simple. The night Brock first told me about her, he was standing in my kitchen with a beer he wasn't drinking, and his eyes were as bright as I had seen them since before his father died. She was standing by herself at the fountain in the courtyard, he said, in this blue dress. And when she turned around, I forgot what I was going to say. I actually forgot the sentence, Mom. Mid-sentence. I was so glad. I want that on the record, too. I stood in my kitchen, and I was so glad that my chest ached with it. My son, who had spent 18 months holding me up, had turned around and found something for himself. Within 2 weeks, they were exclusive. Within 2 months, she had moved into his apartment, the same son who told me at 30 that he valued his own space too much to live with anybody before there was a ring on it. She came to Sunday dinner a month after they met. I still remember the sound of her heels on my hardwood, the bag on her arm, the diamonds in her ears, which were small and very good, and which I priced without meaning to the way you do. She was warm. I have to give her that. She was warm in a way that did not feel like performance. And she was funny about herself, and she asked me 3 questions about my nursing years before she asked me anything about my house, which is more than most people manage. And then somewhere around the 2nd cup of coffee, she said, "Your home is so charming." And she looked around my living room. And I have thought about that look 10,000 times since. And what I saw in it, what I think I saw in it, was not affection. It was inventory. Brock mentioned your husband ran a trucking company, she said. Was it a small local outfit? There was something in the shape of that question. Too direct. Too interested in the business and not the man. In my experience, when a person asks you about your dead husband, they ask what he was like. They do not ask about the size of the operation. Norman built it from 1 truck, I said. It was his life's work. And he sold it before he passed, she said. It must have made for a comfortable retirement. Brock changed the subject then. God bless him, onto a dog with a swallowed sock, and the evening went on and was pleasant, and I laughed twice at things she said. But the moment lodged in me like a splinter under a nail. Small, easy to ignore, impossible to stop feeling. After dinner, Brock and I did the dishes the way we always have, he washing and me drying, because he says I do not get the pans clean, and I say he does not know where anything goes. Dana excused herself to the bathroom. She was gone 19 minutes. I know because the dishes were done and the counters were wiped, and Brock had started telling me about a horse. Later that night, after they had gone, I walked past Norman's study on my way to bed and stopped because the bottom drawer of his desk was pulled out about half an inch. I keep that drawer closed. I have always kept that drawer closed. Norman kept it closed for 30 years before me. It is the drawer where the household papers live, the deed, the insurance binders, the tax folders, and the quarterly and annual statements from Dale Brooks that arrived by mail on heavy cream paper in envelopes with our name in a window. I pushed it shut with my knee, and I went to bed, and I told myself I had opened it myself that morning looking for the property tax bill. I had not opened it that morning. I knew that even as I was telling it to myself. But it was so much easier to be a forgetful old woman for one evening than to be a woman whose son's girlfriend had gone through her husband's desk, and I chose the easier thing. And I want you to remember that I chose it because in about 4 minutes I'm going to tell you what was in that drawer and how much it cost me that I did not look. Trust your gut, Bev Norman used to say. It knows things before your head catches up. My gut was talking that night, and I did what people do with a gut that says something inconvenient at 10:30 at night, when their only child is happier than they have seen him in 2 years. I told it to be quiet, and I went to sleep. 3 days after that dinner, I was standing at my kitchen sink when a sentence Dana had said over dessert came back and hit me square between the shoulder blades. We had been talking, or she had been talking, about how stressful it must be to manage property at my age. And she had said lightly with a fork in her hand, even just keeping the books on something like Cold Storage Unit 4 must be a nightmare. Cold Storage Unit 4. I stood at that sink with the water running over my wrists for a long time. Brock did not know the warehouses by number. Brock could not have told you there were 6 of them. He had been to 2 in his life, both as a teenager, both because his father needed a second pair of hands. I had never told Dana about the warehouses at all. Not that they existed, not how many, not where. And certainly not that the 4th one, the big one outside Galesburg with the rail spur, was by a wide margin the most valuable of the 6, or that the lease on it ran through 2031 at a number that made Dale Brooks smile every time he said it out loud. There is exactly one document in the world on which the phrase Cold Storage Unit 4 Galesburg appears next to a dollar figure. It is the annual statement Dale Brooks mails me every January on heavy cream paper. 11 pages. The last 3 itemize the leased properties by number and location and annual yield. It lives in the bottom drawer of Norman's desk. I went into the study and I pulled that drawer all the way out, and I sat down on the floor of my dead husband's office with the folders in my lap, and went through them one at a time, and everything was there. Nothing was missing. The deed, the binders, the tax folders, the statement 11 pages all present. But the statement was in the wrong folder. It belonged in the green folder marked Brooks 3rd from the back. It was in the manila one marked Taxes 2023 2nd from the front, and it was in there upside down. I am not a tidy person in most respects. My spice rack is a disgrace. But those folders were Norman's system, and I have kept Norman's system since 1987, the way some widows keep a shrine, and I have never once in my life put a statement back upside down. I sat on that floor for I do not know how long. 19 minutes is a very long time in a bathroom. It is a generous amount of time to photograph 11 pages with a phone and to put them back in a hurry in the wrong folder upside down because you can hear that the dishes have stopped. And that is how a woman I had met one time knew within a month what was in my husband's estate and what the 4th building was called. I keep saying I sensed something. That is the flattering version. The truth is that the evidence was lying on the floor of my house, and I picked it up 3 days late, and by then she had already had it for 72 hours. Here is what I want to say about that drawer, and then I will move on. For 38 years, I lived in a house where the most sensitive financial documents in 3 states sat in an unlocked wooden drawer 11 feet from the sofa, because we were quiet people and nobody would think to look. That was the whole security system. Nobody would think to look. Norman's rule was don't let them know there's anything to take. It is a good rule. It worked for 40 years. But it has a fatal property, which is that it only works until it doesn't, and it gives you no second layer because the entire strategy is the first layer. When someone did think to look, there was nothing behind the quiet. No lock, no safe, no sense at all that a person in my living room might be a person who would go through my drawers, because the kind of people who go through your drawers do not come to Sunday dinner, do they? They break a window at 2 in the morning. They do not sit at your table and ask about your nursing career and laugh at your joke about the church rummage sale. That is the thing I most want somebody to take away from all of this, if anybody takes anything. The wrong kind of person almost never comes through the window. I did not go to Brock. I want to be honest about why, because there were 2 reasons and only one of them does me credit. The good reason was that I had nothing. A drawer half an inch open. A folder out of order. A woman who knew a warehouse number. If I had brought that to my son in the first flush of the first real love of his adult life, he would have looked at me with terrible patience and said, Mom and I would have lost him 3 inches and Dana would have gained them. The bad reason is that I was frightened, and frightened people reach for the tool they already know how to use. Mine was silence. Norman had handed it to me 41 years earlier, and I had been holding it so long I had stopped noticing it was in my hand. So I called Ruth Caldwell instead. Ruth has known me since 1984. She spent 22 years in bank compliance, which is the department that exists to notice things, and she retired to a condo with a balcony and a telescope she uses exclusively to watch her neighbors. She is the least sentimental woman I have ever loved. I told her the whole thing. The dinner, the question about the trucking company, the 19 minutes, the drawer, the warehouse number. Ruth was quiet for a while. Then she asked what the girl did for a living. Fundraising, I said. Development at a hospital foundation. The pause on the other end of that line went on so long I said her name twice. "Beverly," she said, "do you know what a development officer actually does all day?" And then she told me. Wealth screening, prospect research, the software, the databases, the confidence ratings. The way a good development officer can build a financial portrait of a stranger out of a name in a business sale that got 2 paragraphs in a regional business journal 8 years ago. She met your son at a fundraiser, Ruth said. And in 2 weeks she was living with him. She said it flatly like a woman reading a number off a page. "I want you to think about the mechanics," she said. "A gala is a room full of donors. Her job in that room is to identify who has money and who is unguarded. That is not a slur, that is the job description. She does it every working day of her life. Now, what are the odds that on the one evening of her career when she has that room mapped out in her head, she happens to fall in love at a fountain with a man whose family sold a company for $50 million? I sat down in Norman's chair. Because the timeline rearranged itself in front of me, the way a magic trick does when somebody shows you the wire. The fountain, the blue dress, turning around at exactly the moment he was looking, forgetting his sentence. It had not been romance at all. My son had not been chosen the way a man hopes to be chosen. He had been screened, and then he had been approached, and the approach had been so well made that he had experienced it as fate. Somewhere in that woman's bag or her phone on the night my son forgot his sentence, there had been a number, my number, $38 million, and she had looked across a courtyard at a kind, lonely veterinarian and seen not a man but a root. Her love had started life as a row in a spreadsheet, and I was the only person on earth who had done the arithmetic. Before Ruth let me off the phone, she made me promise her one thing, and this is the part of the story I have gone back over more times than any other. "Do not tell that girl a single number," she said. "Not what Norman left. Not where it sits. Not $1 of it. And Beverly, do not tell Brock either." That stopped me. "Why not Brock?" I said. "Because he'll tell her," Ruth said. "Not to betray you. Because he's in love, and because he's honest, and because the day after you tell him she will ask him a soft question in bed at 11 at night, and he will answer it, and then she'll have it from a source she trusts. If she loves your boy for himself, your money will never matter to her. And if she doesn't, then the less anybody in that apartment knows, the safer he is." "But Ruth," I said, and I could hear my own voice going thin. "What if I'm wrong? What if she loves him, and I am just a frightened old woman seeing thieves in every shadow?" Ruth was quiet a moment. "Then no harm done," she said. "A secret kept never broke anybody. A fortune handed to the wrong person has broken plenty. I have to stop here. A secret kept never broke anybody." I believed that. I believed it so completely that I built the next 6 months on it, and I want to tell you now, before we go any further, that it is not true. It is one of those sentences that sounds like wisdom because it has a good rhythm. Ruth is the smartest woman I know, and she was wrong. And I was wrong for taking it, and I did not take it because it was correct. I took it because it gave me permission to do the thing I already wanted to do, which was nothing. That is the second lesson of this story, and I will put it here, so you do not have to wait for it when someone gives you advice that costs you nothing and requires you to say nothing. Be very careful. That is exactly the flavor of advice a frightened person goes looking for. I made the promise. I kept it. And it cost me my son's business, a warehouse, a friendship of 40 years and 11 months of my life. And it cost a 19-year-old boy in a hospital bed in a dining room a good deal more than that. In the weeks after that phone call, I watched my son change in small ways that would have meant nothing on their own and meant everything laid side by side. Brock had always been frugal in a way that embarrassed him a little at parties. He drove an 8-year-old Subaru with 140,000 miles on it and a tennis ball wedged under the brake pedal that he kept meaning to get out of there. He owned 2 sport coats and had worn one of them to his own father's funeral and the other to my 65th birthday. Then one Tuesday there was a watch on his wrist that I knew cost more than the Subaru. 2 weeks later, a leather jacket. Then a phone that was 3 generations newer than mine. Then a vagueness in his voice whenever I asked about any of it. I deserved to enjoy things a little, Mom. I had never once heard that sentence come out of my son. Not at any age. It was not his. It was hers, and I could hear her behind it the way you can hear the original singer behind a cover version. The calls thinned out too. My son, who phoned me every evening at 7, went 3 days quiet, and then 4. When we did speak, Dana was often in the room contributing a bright remark every couple of minutes so that I would know she was there. Our weekly coffee became monthly. Then it became a thing we kept meaning to schedule. Once on a Tuesday in February, I called him at 8 at night because I simply missed the sound of his voice, and Dana answered his phone. "He's in the shower," she said. "We're so behind on thank you notes you would not believe the week we've had." We chatted for a minute about nothing, and then lightly in the tone a person uses about the weather. "Beverly, can I ask you something a little nosy? Did Norman leave the trucking proceeds in a trust, or did it all come to you outright? Only Brock has no idea, and it feels rude to ask him." And I said, "Oh, honey, Norman handled all of that. I've never been one for the financial end of things. That was a lie. Norman spent our last 4 years going through every account, every clause, every beneficiary designation at that dining table with a legal pad, because he had decided that I was going to be able to run it all alone if it came to that, and he was not going to leave me the way men leave their wives with a folder and a phone number. I know what a step up in basis is. I know what our municipal ladder yields. I can read Dale Brooks's 11-page statement front to back and tell you which line he is going to want to talk about. But something in me, the thing that hears a rehearsed answer, told me to play the woman who does not know her own numbers. So I played her. And Dana let it go with a small laugh and said we should have lunch, and I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen a long time in the dark, troubled in a way I could not yet name. Here is what I know now that I did not know then. That lie worked. That is the problem with it. It worked perfectly. Dana believed it, and she reported it back to the man who was standing behind her whole life, and he heard the old woman doesn't understand her own money, and he adjusted his plan accordingly. If I had said, "Dana, yes, there is a great deal of money, it is mine, it is protected, and Brock will not see a dollar of it while I am alive." If I had said that one true sentence in February on the phone in my kitchen, the entire back half of this story does not happen. I did not say it. I said the safe thing. And the safe thing, it turns out, is only safe for the person saying it. The first bill came due in the shape of a wedding. Brock called me on a Wednesday 4 months and 1 week after he met her with that same rehearsed brightness I had started to dread. "We're engaged, Mom. I asked her last night. She said yes." I gripped the counter and made my voice warm, and it was not entirely an effort, because there is a part of a mother that hears her son say she said yes and goes straight up like a bird no matter what the rest of her knows. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Have you set a date?" "Next month," he said. I could not keep it out of my voice. "Next month, Brock, that is very soon. When you know, you know." That is what he said. My son, who has never in his life made a decision larger than a tire purchase without a legal pad, and 2 weeks of brooding, who took 4 months to choose a practice management software, who dated a lovely girl named Priya for a year and a half in his 20s, and could not decide about her, and lost her to a man who could. When you know, you know. It came out of him like a line read off a card because it was a line read off a card. "Dana's always dreamed of a spring wedding," he said. And then there was a pause, and I could hear him gathering himself up through the phone, and he said the thing he had actually called to say. "I was hoping we could talk about you helping with some of the costs. A vet's salary doesn't stretch the way it used to, and Dana has her heart set on a few special touches." That was the first time in my son's adult life that he asked me for money. I want that understood. Norman and I raised him not to, and he had worn that like a good coat since he was 22. He turned down help with vet school. He turned down help with the down payment on the practice, and took a worse rate from a credit union instead. When his transmission went at 30, and I offered, he said, "Mom, if I can't cover a transmission, I shouldn't be driving a car." Now he was asking, and I could hear that he hated it, and I could hear that the asking had not started in him. Of course I said, "Come by this weekend and we'll go over the details." After I hung up, I sat in Norman's study and looked at his photograph on the desk. The one from the loading dock in 1994, sunburned, squinting, 41 years old, and about to have the best decade of his working life. "What would you do?" I asked him, and I could hear him perfectly, because I always could. "Protect our boy Bev, but let him make his own mistakes," which is exactly the kind of advice that sounds complete, and is not, because the entire question is which kind of mistake this was. There are mistakes a young man recovers from by 36 with a funny story, and there are mistakes that take the rest of his working life and his mother's fortune, and a piece of his ability to trust anybody ever again. Norman never had to tell me which one this was. He was 18 months dead. I have noticed that the dead are extremely agreeable, and give you back precisely the advice you brought into the room. What Brock had called a few special touches turned out to be a spreadsheet. Dana brought it to my kitchen that Saturday and slid it across the table with the ease of a woman handing back a menu. A designer gown, a custom tuxedo, top shelf open bar for $150, a 5-course seated dinner, a 9-piece band, flowers flown in from Ecuador, a photographer who normally shoots magazine covers and whose deposit alone was $8,000. The total at the bottom read $95,000. Brock sat beside her, studying the grain of my kitchen table, the new watch catching the light every time he moved his arm, and he did not say one word. "That is a great deal for one afternoon," I said carefully. Dana gave a practiced little laugh. "Well, we only do this once, and honestly this is quite reasonable for what people spend now." I looked at my son and waited for him to meet my eyes. He did not. "I can contribute $25,000, I said. I chose that number on purpose, and I have thought a great deal since about what kind of woman chooses a number on purpose. 25,000 is generous. It is also a rounding error against 38 million, and I did not pick it because it was what I could afford. I picked it because I wanted to watch what would happen to her face when the number stopped. Her smile held. Something behind it dropped several degrees. "That's very kind," she said. "But we were rather hoping you might cover the whole thing. Traditionally, the bride's family pays, of course, but mine is in a difficult spot right now." A difficult spot. It landed on the table and sat there, and I filed it away, and I did not ask one single follow-up question about it, and God forgive me, that was the moment. If you want to know where this whole thing turned, it was not in the living room with the briefcase 5 months later. It was right there in my kitchen when a 30-year-old woman told me her family was in a difficult spot, and I said nothing because I had already decided she was a liar and I was not going to be worked. She was, in fact, in a difficult spot. It was the truest sentence she said to me in 6 months. I heard it as a technique. "Dad would want us to have a beautiful day," Brock added, finally looking up, "and that my son using his father's memory to lever open my checkbook, so clumsily, so entirely unlike himself, nearly broke my heart in half." "Your father believed in living within your means," I said as gently as I could manage. 25,000 is my gift, and it is a real gift. You two will find a way to manage the rest, or you'll choose a smaller day. Either one is just fine with me." They left with Dana's disappointment barely inside its box. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Dana's pretty hurt. She says most mothers, especially widows who were left comfortable, would want to do more for their only son. Can we talk about it? I read it twice and then a third time, and there it was in writing. Widows who were left comfortable. She had the 11 pages. She knew to the dollar, and she was using my son's thumbs to work at me. I did not increase the gift. I sent the 25,000 the next morning and let the silence do the talking. Now, I have replayed that decision more times than any other in this story, and I want to give you both halves of it honestly, because people who hear this tend to applaud there, and I am not sure they should. Holding at 25,000 was correct. I still believe that. A person who is being pressured for money should not pay, and a mother who buys her son's piece at $95,000 will be asked for $190 the following spring. But I did not know what I was doing. I thought I was closing a door. What I was actually doing was creating a $70,000 hole in a wedding that a desperate woman had already promised to a man she owed money to. And that hole did not close. It went looking for something to fill it, and what it found was my son's veterinary practice, and I did not learn that for 5 more months. Over the next 3 weeks, I was quietly walked to the edge of my only child's wedding. Dana took every decision and consulted me only when a vendor needed paying. I found out the venue had changed from a friend at church. I found out the date had moved by 4 days when the invitation came addressed to Mrs. Norman Bishop, which no one has called me since 1991. She ordered a mother-of-the-groom dress for me without asking. Navy shapeless, 2 sizes too large, and about 20 years too old. The kind of dress they put on a woman when what they want in the photographs is a shape and not a person. When I exchanged it for something gray that actually fit, I received a very tight 7-minute phone call about respecting the vision. I let it go. Every one of these things I let go. I was learning that with Dana, each small surrender bought me a little more room to watch. That is what I told myself anyway, and it was even partly true. But I want to be accurate about my own motives here, because it would be easy to make myself sound like a spy holding position. I was also just avoiding a fight. I was 68 years old and 18 months widowed, and I did not have a fight in me. And watching is a very dignified word for what I was doing, which was going along. The one thing I did not go along with was money. Not $1 past the 25. And that, I think, is the only reason any of us are still standing. The dress fitting was 10 days before the wedding. I went because I was asked, and I was asked because a photograph of the two mothers and the bride was on the vision board. Dana's mother, Carol Mercer, was already there when I arrived. A soft, tired woman in a department store cardigan with a hard little handbag in her lap, sitting on a velvet bench in a shop where a veil cost more than her car. She looked as out of place among the silk as I felt, and I liked her instantly the way you like anybody who is visibly having the same afternoon as you. While Dana was behind the curtain, Carol worked at the strap of her purse and tried to make conversation, and she asked me 3 questions about being a nurse and told me about her sister who was an aide at a nursing home in Peoria. And then she patted my hand. I have to tell you, she said, when Dana told us Brock's family had the trucking company, all those trucks and the warehouses and the sale and everything, well, Walter and I just felt so much better about it. She was not bragging. That is what I want you to hear. There was no cunning in that woman at all. After the year we've had, she said, knowing she'd be looked after, knowing the family had that kind of security. And then she said it was such a relief. She set the word relief down the way you set down something you have been carrying a very long way, with her whole back. I smiled and said something kind and felt the floor go soft under me, because that sentence told me 2 things at once. It told me that Dana had described my family's finances to her parents in specific inventory detail, the trucks, the warehouses, the sale, long before there was any wedding, which meant the screening had happened early, and the picture she carried of us was exact. And it told me in the sound of that woman's exhausted relief that the Mercers were drowning in something, and that their daughter's marriage to my son was the rope somebody had thrown them. I did not ask Carol Mercer a single question about the year they'd had. 10 days from the wedding in a bridal shop with a soft, honest, frightened woman patting my hand and practically begging to be asked. I said nothing because I had a promise to Ruth and a strategy and a plan, and asking would have shown my hand. Every single door in this story was standing open at some point. I walked past all of them, holding my cards close. 6 days before the wedding, Dana came by alone in the evening with a slim folder and a pen already uncapped. Just some paperwork for the event insurance, she said. The venue needs a family signatory on the liability rider, and Brock's tied up at the clinic until 9, and the coordinator said any immediate family member works. It's totally standard. You just sign at the little flags. She had stuck the colored tabs along the edge herself. 4 of them. I took the folder and reached for my reading glasses and found, of course, that they were in the other room. I'll just be a moment, I said. And then I did something I am not proud of, and have never once regretted. I left the folder open on the kitchen table, and I took my time in the bedroom, and when I came back, I sat down and put my glasses on and read every single page slowly, one at a time, while Dana talked about centerpieces. She had to keep talking. That was the thing. She had built the whole approach on the assumption that I would sign at the flags, and once I was reading, she could not tell me to stop reading, so she sat there and narrated hydrangeas at me for 11 minutes while her face slowly emptied out. The first 2 pages were event insurance. Real boring, correct. Page 3 was a liability rider that mentioned the venue twice and then stopped mentioning the venue. Pages 4 through 9 were a durable power of attorney. I had seen that language exactly once before in my life in Patricia Hale's office, when Norman and I signed ours for each other. Full authority to act on my behalf in all financial matters, including but not limited to. And then the list: banking, securities, real property, tax matters, claims and litigation. The named individual was not the venue, and it was not the coordinator, and it was not Dana Mercer either. It was a name I did not know. Garrett M. Vance. I have never been able to keep my face from doing what it wants, so I kept it pointed straight down at the paper. I'm sorry, dear, I said. My reading isn't what it was in the evening. I'll have Dale look these over and get them back to you Monday. Her jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Oh, the coordinator really needs them tonight. Then the coordinator can call me in the morning, I said pleasantly, and I closed the folder and set my hand flat on top of it. There was a moment there. I want to describe it properly. It was 4 or 5 seconds long, and it was the first time I had ever been physically afraid of her, not of what she would do. She is 120 pounds, and I am not but afraid the way you are when the person across from you stops being the person you were talking to, and you see the mechanism underneath. Then she laughed and said something about coordinators and stood up and said she'd swing by Monday, and she left the folder on my table, which I have always thought was the single biggest mistake anybody made in this entire story. She left it because she could not take it back without admitting what it was. Before I went to bed, I laid all 9 pages out on the kitchen counter under the good light and photographed each one twice, and then a third time of just the signature block with the name on it, and I emailed all of it to myself and to Ruth with no message in the body. Then I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher, which is a thing I have done perhaps 4 times in my adult life, and shook. I called Ruth in the morning, and we had the first real argument of our friendship. She wanted me to take the folder to Patricia Hale that day. She was right. It is the single best piece of evidence anybody produced in 11 months, and she wanted it in a lawyer's hands and a copy with the police, and she said so twice. And I said no. I said the wedding is Saturday. She said, Beverly, that is the point. And I said the thing I have gone back over most. I said, Ruth, if I take this to a lawyer on Tuesday, then on Saturday, my son is either standing at an altar alone in front of 150 people, or he is standing next to her hating me. And either way, whatever she is, I will have done that to him publicly. He'll never come back from it. He'll never come back to me from it. Ruth was quiet, and then she said, so what you're telling me is that you would rather he found out privately later at more cost. Yes, I said. Fine, she said. But understand what you're choosing. You are not choosing to protect him. You are choosing to protect the photographs. I hung up on her. 68 years old, and I hung up on my oldest friend like a teenager because she had said the exact true thing and I could not carry it. We did not speak for 11 days. I have gone over that argument 100 times. Ruth was right, and I was wrong, and I want to say plainly that Ruth being right is not the same as Ruth being innocent because it was Ruth's advice in the fall. Don't tell Brock either that had built the walls of the box I was standing in by May. She handed me the strategy, and then she was furious that I ran it. We got to that eventually. That comes later. The rehearsal dinner was on the Friday in the back room of an Italian place with brick walls, and it was the closest thing to a good evening any of us had that spring. Cody was there. I need to tell you about Cody because I met him that night, and I did not know anything, and I still could not stop watching him. He was Dana's younger brother, 19 years old, in a suit that hung off him, the way a suit hangs off a boy who has recently stopped being a certain size. He had no eyebrows. He had that particular gray under the eyes, and the beanie in a warm room, and the way of sitting down carefully in stages. I have been a pediatric nurse for 31 years. I did not need anybody to tell me what I was looking at. I could have told you the ward and the drug class from the doorway. I said to Dana at the drinks table as lightly as I could, your brother's a handsome boy. Has he been unwell? And Dana said without any change in her face at all, he's had a rough winter. Mono, and then he couldn't shake it. A rehearsed answer. Clean in order, anticipating the follow-up. And I stood there, and I knew it was a lie. And I knew exactly what kind of lie it was, the kind a family tells to keep a wedding from becoming about a sick boy. And I said, oh, those can drag on, can't they? And I walked away with my glass of wine. I could have sat down next to that child for 10 minutes. He was 2 feet away. He was 19 and alone at a table, and everybody in the room was avoiding him because sick people make weddings awkward. And I was the one person in that building with 3 decades of knowing exactly how to talk to him. I did not do it because I had decided that everything that came out of the Mercers was a maneuver, and by then I could not tell a boy with leukemia from a tactic. That is what 6 months of quiet vigilance had done to me. I want that in the record next to all the parts where I was clever. And then in the parking lot, my son asked me directly, and I lied to his face. He walked me out to the Volvo. The evening had gone well. There had been a toast he was loose in a way I had not seen in months. He opened my door for me the way Norman taught him, and then he leaned on the top of it and did not let me get in. Mom, he said, can I ask you something and you tell me straight? Of course. Is there something going on with you and Dana? I said something about it being a stressful season. He shook his head. No, that's not Mom. She thinks you don't like her. And I keep telling her you're just private. But then you did the thing with the dress, and you've been weird about the wedding money, and you didn't come to the tasting. I wasn't invited to the tasting, I said. He blinked. He genuinely had not known that. Then he said it. He looked at me over the top of the car door with his father's face on him, and he said, Is there money, Mom? I did not answer immediately, and he took that for confusion, and he kept going. Because Dana keeps she has this idea that Dad left more than we think. And I keep telling her no, he sold the company, but there were partners and debt and taxes, and Mom lives on a nurse's pension in the same house I grew up in, and she looks at me like I'm a child. And I feel like a child. So I'm asking you, is there money? There was a full second there where I nearly told him everything, I have described this to exactly 3 people, and none of them have understood it, so let me try harder. It was not a temptation I resisted. It was more like standing at the edge of a pool in January. The whole true answer was right there, fully formed. There is $38 million, sweetheart. Your father was better at his job than anybody knew, and I think your fiancé has known the exact figure since October. And I have a folder in my kitchen with a stranger's name on it, and it was all sitting in my mouth ready to go. And I thought he will tell her tonight. Not out of weakness, out of love. He would go home and he would say, I asked, and there's nothing. And then at some point in the next week, he would say, actually, there was something, because he cannot hold a thing back from a person he is sleeping next to. And he never could, and I raised him that way on purpose. And I thought about Ruth's voice. If she loves your boy for himself, your money will never matter to her. And I said, your father left me comfortable, honey. The house is paid for and I don't have to worry. But there's no fortune. There were partners and taxes, and it went the way those things go. And I watched my son's shoulders come down about an inch with relief, because he did not want there to be money, because if there was money, then his fiancée was right about something ugly. Okay, he said. Okay, good. That's what I told her. He kissed the top of my head and put me in my car. I drove home doing 30 in a 45, and I had to pull over twice. I want to be precise about what I did in that parking lot, because for a long time I called it keeping my counsel, and that is not what it was. My son came to me with a direct question, asked in good faith about a thing that was materially shaping his life, and I gave him a false answer, and I did it to control what he would do with the truth. That is not privacy. Privacy is declining to answer. I have every right to decline to answer questions about my own money, and if I had said, Brock, my finances are mine and you'll know what you need to know when you need to know it, that would have been hard and honest, and he would have hated it for a week, and it would have blown Dana's entire operation apart within a month, because the one thing her plan could not survive was Brock knowing that a real amount existed and was firmly not available. Instead, I told him there was no fortune. And so when Dana came to him 3 weeks later and said, we need money, your mother won't help, we'll have to find it ourselves. My son believed there was nothing to find, and he went and found it somewhere else. He signed for $180,000 against his practice, because his mother had told him in a parking lot that the family had nothing. That is not a consequence I have made up in hindsight to punish myself with. He said it to me later at my kitchen table in exactly those words, and he was not accusing me when he said it. That was the worst part. He said it the way you report the weather. The wedding was on a Saturday in the middle of May, and I went and I wore the gray dress that fit. I watched my son marry a woman in a gown that cost more than my first house in front of 150 guests under flowers flown up from the equator, and the ceremony was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, which is to say completely and without any surprises. 2 things from that day have stayed with me. The first was during the vows. Brock's voice went out in sickness and in health, and he had to stop and start again, and the whole room made that warm noise a room makes. And Dana, I was 8 feet away and I was looking directly at her. Dana closed her eyes. Not the way a bride closes her eyes. She closed them the way you do when something hurts and you are trying to be somewhere else for a second. It lasted less than a breath. Then she opened them and smiled at him, and it was gone. I filed that away with everything else and understood it 11 months later. The second was the recessional. When the officiant said husband and wife and they turned to face the room, Dana's face came around to all those people. And it was, I called it triumphant at the time. I told Ruth it was triumphant. I said her smile was like a hand closing around a prize and the champagne went sour in my mouth. I have looked at the photographs since, many times. It is not triumph. I do not know what to call it exactly. The nearest I can get is the face of a person who has just watched a door close from the inside. Cody was in the 3rd row on the bride's side with a bottle of water and his mother's hand on his back. They left for Santorini 2 days later. And 5 days after the vows, while my son and his wife were supposed to be on a cliff above the Aegean, I was on my knees in the garden with the pruning shears, and I heard tires on the gravel. I looked up, and there was the black Mercedes, and Dana getting out in the white pantsuit, and a stranger coming around the front of the car with a briefcase. I peeled off my gloves 1 finger at a time, which is a thing I do when I need 3 extra seconds, and I walked down toward them with my heart going hard and slow. Dana, I said, this is a surprise. I thought you 2 were in Greece until next week. We were, she said. And that was all. No explanation, no story about a canceled flight. Just we were. Beverly, this is Garrett Vance. He's our family's financial advisor. We need to discuss something important. Their family's financial advisor. 5 days married, and there was already a family advisor I had never heard of, and there was a tone in my daughter-in-law's voice that had dropped every last bit of warmth the way you set down a bag you have been carrying to be polite. "Where is Brock?" I asked her. "He's meeting a realtor about a property we like," she said. "He sends his love. He thought this would go easier without him." That was not my son. I knew it in my body before I knew it in my head. My son does not send his mother a stranger in a briefcase and stay home. Whatever else was true, that sentence was a forgery, and I recognized it, the way you recognize a signature that has been traced all the right shapes, none of the right pressure. "Come inside," I said. "I'll put on coffee." I want to explain that because 2 different people have since asked me why on earth I let them in. I let them in because I wanted to hear all of it. Because 6 months of half signals and splinters and folders had made me hungry for one clean look at the thing, and here it was walking up my steps in a good suit. And because I was 69 years old on my own property in the middle of the afternoon, and I have never in my life been able to imagine that the worst thing might happen to me. I made coffee in the good pot. I put out the cream. My hands were steady. 31 years of pediatric nursing gives you that at least the ability to be entirely calm on the outside, while the inside of you is doing something else. Garrett Vance was about 55. Gray at the temples, good haircut tie, and a small tight knot. A wristwatch that did not announce itself. He had the particular physical stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is the most intimidating thing available in a living room, and he thanked me twice for the coffee and used my name in every third sentence. "Mrs. Bishop," he began. "Thank you for your hospitality. I know this is unexpected." He opened the briefcase and laid out documents in a fan, unhurried the way a man deals cards when he is not worried about the hand. "I've been asked to help the family think through some financial matters," he said. "Before we go anywhere else, I want to say I'm sorry about your husband. I understand he built something remarkable." "He did," I said. "Bishop Freight," he said. "Sold in 2019 to a national." He nodded slowly as though remembering it fondly as though he had been there. And then he said, "Mrs. Bishop, it's come to our attention that following your husband's passing, you inherited approximately $38 million. The number went through me like ice water in a vein. I had said that figure out loud to exactly 3 people in my life. Dale Brooks, Patricia Hale, and my sister once in a car. And how I asked, keeping my voice absolutely level, did that come to your attention? Dana leaned forward. The charming daughter-in-law was gone. What sat in her place was flat and hard, and I thought at the time deeply pleased with itself. "Brock came across some of his father's old papers," she said. "We were surprised, honestly. Given how you live. Given how you live." I looked at the woman in my husband's chair and thought, you photographed 11 pages in my bathroom in October, and you are sitting in my house telling me my son found them, because you know I cannot prove otherwise. Garrett Vance folded his hands. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "Dana and Brock feel that as the sole heir, Brock should have access to a meaningful portion of these funds now rather than in 30 years. We've prepared what I think is a reasonable proposal." He slid a page across the table. $6 million to allow the couple to purchase a home and establish themselves, plus the transfer of one of the cold storage properties into Brock's name. Which one, I said. He did not miss a beat. "Galesburg. Of course it was Galesburg. Of course it was." "We aren't getting any younger," Dana said with a boldness that took my breath. "And frankly, it seems selfish to hoard this much while your own son lives the way he does." I set my cup down. "And if I decline," I said. And here is where the afternoon stopped being what I thought it was. Because I expected a threat. I had braced for one. And what Garrett Vance actually did was reach into the briefcase and take out a different document altogether, a thick one stapled at the corner, and turn it around and push it across to me with 2 fingers. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, "I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to be direct with you, because I don't think anybody has been. This isn't really a negotiation about your estate. Your estate is yours. Nobody at this table has any claim on it, and I would never suggest otherwise." I looked down. It was a commercial promissory note. $180,000 secured by the assets, equipment, receivables, and leasehold of Birchwood Animal Care, LLC. Dated 11 days before the wedding. The interest rate was on the second page in the same typeface as everything else, which is how they do it, and it was 34%. The borrower's signature was my son's. I would know it anywhere. He makes the B like his father did. The lender was G.M. Vance Capital Holdings. Your son borrowed $180,000 from me to pay for his wedding and clear some family obligations, Vance said, voluntarily, with his signature, which I'm sure you recognize. The first payment is due in 19 days. It is $11,400, and there are 36 of them, and if he misses 2 consecutively, I am entitled to accelerate the entire balance and collect against the practice. He let that sit. Now he said, I have no interest in a veterinary clinic. What would I do with it? I have every interest in being paid. And the fastest, cleanest, least painful way for that to happen is the arrangement Dana described, from which I would take my portion and disappear from all of your lives permanently. That is the entire proposal. $6 million, as I understand, less than 16% of your holdings. And your son keeps his business. I sat in my own living room with cold coffee in front of me and understood that I had been outplayed for 6 months by somebody I had not even known existed. Every move I had made, the $25,000, the parking lot, the promise to Ruth, the silence, the cleverness had funneled directly here. And I said, because it was the only thing I could think of, why would Brock sign this? He doesn't sign anything without reading it. And Dana said, and this is the sentence I hear at night, because his mother told him there was no money. There was a long silence in my house. Then Garrett Vance stood, buttoned his jacket, and said in a perfectly warm and pleasant voice, Mrs. Bishop, I'd like to leave you with one more thought, and then we'll go. You're 69. You are managing $38 million alone. You've recently been widowed, and you have taken to keeping unsigned power of attorney documents belonging to other people in your kitchen. If this becomes adversarial, and I sincerely hope it doesn't, there are questions a court might reasonably ask about whether a woman in your circumstances should be handling assets of that size unassisted. Courts tend to be sympathetic to a child's concern for a parent, and I would find that outcome unfortunate, he said. For everybody. I stood up. Slowly, because my knees are what they are, and because I was not going to do it fast. I felt 41 years of Norman's caution come up my spine like rebar. I think you should both leave my house now, I said. Vance nodded unbothered and picked up his briefcase. He left the promissory note on the table, which was intentional, and he left the $6 million proposal beside it, which was also intentional. Dana stopped at the door. This isn't over, Beverly, she said. You can share what belongs to this family, or you can lose your son. That's the choice. And her voice broke on the word son. I did not hear it at the time. I have heard it since 10,000 times because I wrote it down within 4 minutes of her leaving, and I have read what I wrote about 100 times, and what I wrote was her voice broke from anger. It was not anger. I know that now. But I wrote from anger because at that point I could not have told you what else a woman like that would break for. They drove off. I stood in my hallway and shook for a solid minute, both hands flat on the wall, and when my fingers would work, I got my phone and called Patricia Hale's office and told the secretary it was an emergency. Patricia came on in 90 seconds. I said my daughter-in-law just sat in my living room with a man named Garrett Vance and demanded $6 million and a warehouse and threatened to have me declared incompetent, and my son has apparently signed a $180,000 note against his practice at 34%. Patricia said one word. She said Beverly. And then she said, don't move. Don't call Brock. Write down every single thing that was said while it is fresh in their words, not yours. Photograph both documents front and back, including the staples. I'll be there at 8 tomorrow morning. Am I in trouble, Patricia? She said you are not. Your son is in a great deal. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight, with a legal pad writing down every word and then going back and correcting the parts I had softened. I have that legal pad still. It is in a box in the study with the rest of it. The handwriting on the first page is fine, and by the 3rd page it has come apart at the edges. At the bottom of the last page at 11:40 at night, I wrote a sentence to myself that I did not fully understand for another 5 months. He never once asked for the money. He asked me to pay a debt. Somewhere over the Atlantic or in a rented apartment on the other side of town, my son was either flying home to a marriage built on a lie, or he was already home and had no idea what was being done in his name. Either way, the waiting was finally over. Whatever this was, it had shown me its face. What I did not understand sitting at that table at midnight was that it had shown me a face, and I had matched it to the wrong body. I had spent 6 months building a portrait of a cold, grasping woman with an advisor at her elbow. It was the other way around. It had been the other way around from the beginning. She was not the one with the advisor. She was the instrument. The doorbell rang at 20 to 7 the next morning. I had slept perhaps 2 hours. Patricia was not due until 8, and my first thought with my hand already on the deadbolt was that Dana had come back with fresh demands, and I actually said out loud to nobody all right then. I opened the door, and my son was standing on the porch alone. Brock looked nothing like a man 5 days married. His eyes were red-rimmed and sunk. He was wearing the same shirt I had seen him in at the rehearsal dinner, slept in and slept in again. He had 4 days of beard and the scraped-out hollow look of somebody who has been awake with his own thoughts for a long time and has not liked the company. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the one syllable. "Can I come in?" I pulled him into my arms the way I did when he was 6 and feverish, and he was too tall for it and did it anyway, and I felt him shaking through the back of his shirt. Then I sat him at the kitchen table and put the kettle on because that is what I do when my son is breaking, and I waited. He wrapped both hands around the mug I set down and did not drink any of it. "We came home early," he said to the wood grain. "Dana said she had a work emergency." "But that wasn't true," I said, and it was not a question. He looked up, and the misery in his face was so total that I had to hold myself still to keep from going around the table. "Yesterday afternoon she said she was meeting a colleague," he said. "When she came back she'd been crying, and then she was furious. She said she'd stopped by to check on you, and you'd been cruel to her. Dismissive. That you humiliated her and told her she'd married into a family that would never accept her." He shook his head slowly. "I almost believed her, Mom. That's the part I keep choking on. I wanted to believe her because if she was telling the truth, then I'm just a guy whose mother and wife don't get along, and that's a normal problem, and people have that problem." "Brock," I said, "Dana did come here yesterday, but not to check on me and not alone." And then I told him. All of it plainly, the way you set a heavy thing down in front of somebody who is going to have to pick it up. Garrett Vance, the briefcase, the exact figure, the $6 million in Galesburg, the suggestion that a court might wonder whether I ought to be handling my own affairs. I watched my son's face travel through confusion and disbelief and arrive at something worse than either a kind of quiet arithmetic, like a man reading the last page of a book he has been refusing to finish for 100 pages. $6 million, he said. "She asked you for $6 million. And the Galesburg property," I said. He put his palms over his eyes. And then I said, because there was no version of this where I did not Brock. "There is $38 million. I did not move. Your father sold the company for 50, after tax and the payout structure and 18 months of Dale being very good at his job. What came to me was $38 million and the 6 warehouses and the house." He took his hands down. He looked at me. He did not look angry. I could have handled angry. "In the parking lot," he said. "At the rehearsal dinner." "Yes. I asked you." "Yes. And you said there was no fortune." I said yes. I did. I lied to you. I want to say it in those words, so there's no way for either of us to make it into something softer later. You asked me a direct question, and I gave you a false answer, and I did it because I had decided I knew better than you what you could be trusted with. My son sat in my kitchen and cried then, and I sat across from him and did not touch him, because I had not earned it yet, and because he did not want me to. When he could talk again, he said the sentence that took the floor out. "I signed a note, Mom." "I know," I said. "It was on the table when they left. 180,000. His head came up. There was something almost like relief in it, the relief of not having to say the number out loud himself. 34%, he said, which I did know. I want to be clear, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I didn't know the rate. I read it. I read the whole thing, Mom. That's the everybody's going to assume I got tricked and I didn't. I read it twice and I signed it anyway. Why, I said. And he said, because there was $70,000 of wedding that had to be paid in 12 days, and Dana said her family would cover their share, and then said they couldn't, and because I had asked my mother for money once in my life and been told no, and because you told me in a parking lot that there was nothing behind me. So there was nothing behind me. So the practice was the only thing I had. He turned the cold mug a quarter turn. If you had told me the truth, he said, I'd have known that, even in the worst case, if the whole thing went wrong, my family could survive 180 grand. And if I'd known that I'd have had the nerve to say no to her because the only reason I couldn't say no was that I thought saying no meant the wedding collapsed and everybody found out we were broke. He said it without heat. That is what I mean about how bad it was. He said it the way you report the weather. I know exactly what that sounds like, he said. It sounds like I'm blaming you. I'm not. I signed it. It's my signature and my business and my marriage. But you asked why, and that's why. I have had 11 months to construct a defense of myself, and I have not been able to build one that stands up, so I am not going to try. Here is the closest I can get. I did not lie to my son to keep money from him. I have never cared about the money. I would have written a check for the entire $38 million that morning to get him out of that chair. I lied to my son because I did not trust him to hold a true thing correctly. That is all it was in the end. Not greed, not even really fear of Dana. A judgment made in a parking lot in 4 seconds that my 33-year-old son, a man who runs a business who puts animals down with his hands and then goes and sits in his car for 10 minutes, who had held me up for 18 months while I fell apart, could not be told the truth about his own family because he might handle it badly. Norman and I decided that when he was 4, and then we never revisited it. That is the actual crime if there is one, not the decision. The failure to ever open it up again and check whether it was still true for 30 years until the day the decision was so old and so load-bearing that I made it again without even thinking, standing in a parking lot with my hand on a car door. We had about 50 minutes before Patricia arrived, and my son used them to tell me what he had not told anybody. I knew, he said. Not the demand. Not the number, not the meeting, not that she came here. But I knew something was badly wrong with her, and I knew it before the wedding, and I married her anyway. The kettle ticked as it cooled. Tell me, I said. On our second night in Santorini, I woke up at 3 in the morning, and she wasn't in the bed. I found her on the bathroom floor in the dark, with the door almost shut, crying. Not sad crying, scared crying. And she was on the phone whispering, and when she heard me, she hung up so fast she dropped it on the tile. I asked what was wrong, and she said she'd had a bad dream. He turned the mug again. The next morning I checked her phone while she was in the shower. I have never done that in my life. I felt sick doing it, and I did it anyway. The last call was 41 minutes at 3:04 in the morning to a contact saved as G. He looked at me. And there were others. Going back 7 months. Always late at night, always under 3 minutes. Except that one. 7 months, I said. Which is before the gala, he said. By about 3 weeks. We sat with that. What else, I said. He said he had started watching her the way you watch a road sign you think you misread. She went gray and quiet when a certain kind of envelope came. She had a second email account that she closed the laptop on. She kept her phone face down on every surface in the world. And she flinched. This was the detail that did it to me. She flinched at the sound of a car in the parking lot below their apartment every time for months, and he had thought it was a jumpy person's tic. And then 2 days before we flew home, he said I found a folder she'd left in the hotel safe, and I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. His voice changed then, and I understood we had arrived at the floor. She has a brother, he said. Cody, he's 19. It isn't mono. He has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and he relapsed in November, and the folder was full of billing statements and a denial letter from an insurer and a foreclosure notice on her parents' house, and a payment schedule to somebody with an interest rate on it that made me feel physically ill, which I now know was the same rate as mine, because it's the same man. He set both hands flat on the table like a person steadying it. The Mercers aren't in a difficult spot, Mom. They're at the bottom of the ocean. Her father mortgaged the house for the treatment, and it wasn't enough, and then he went somewhere that wasn't a bank. And Dana, he said, and his throat worked. Dana decided the way to fix it was to marry me. I sat very still and let it come down on me, this terrible new weight. I had spent 6 months constructing a villain, a cold, grasping woman with calculation behind the eyes, and I had been right about nearly every individual fact and completely wrong about the shape of the whole thing. Carol Mercer's hand on mine in the bridal shop came back. After the year we've had. The way she had set the word relief down with her whole back. A boy in a suit that no longer fit sitting down carefully in stages 2 feet away from me, while I decided that his sister was a maneuver and walked off with my glass of wine. Here is what I felt, and I am not proud of how complicated it was. I was a pediatric nurse for 31 years. I have sat with parents in the worst hours of their lives while a child fought for breath. I know exactly what happens to a family when one of its children is dying and the money runs out, the way the fear strips a person down to the studs and makes them capable of things they would have sworn on their own mother they were not capable of. I have watched a mild-mannered accountant scream at a billing clerk until security came. I have watched a woman steal syringes. So the professional grief opened up in me for a frightened girl trying to keep her brother alive. And in the very same breath, my spine held because a reason is not the same thing as a right. Whatever drove Dana to my son's door, she lied her way into his life. She screened him like a mark. She photographed my husband's papers in my bathroom. She put a false document under my hand and told me it was insurance. She sat in my living room and watched a man threaten to have me declared unfit and did not say one word. A dying brother explains all of that. It excuses none of it. Those two truths sat in me side by side and refused to cancel each other out. And 11 months later, they are both still sitting there, and I have stopped waiting for one of them to win. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about that morning. There was still the question I had not asked, and I asked it then because Patricia's car was going to be in my driveway in 20 minutes, and I did not want a lawyer in the room for it. Brock, if you knew on the second night of your honeymoon, if you saw the calls and the crying in that folder, why did you say nothing? Why did you get on the plane and come home and let it all keep going? Why didn't you confront her? Or why didn't you call me? My son looked out the kitchen window at the rose bushes for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, and it was the voice of the boy, not the man. Because I was ashamed, he said. I'm going to tell you the whole thing because you told me yours. He swallowed. I'm 33. I fix cats and dogs, and I go home to an empty apartment, and I have been lonely for years, Mom and I never told you, because you just lost Dad and you had enough, and because Dad made it sound like being alone was a thing a man handled. He never said that, but everything about him said that. Grandpa's business went under and he left school and he handled it, and nobody in this family has ever once said out loud that a thing was hard. He laughed one breath with nothing in it, and then this clever, beautiful woman looked at me across a fountain like I was the only person in the room. I know now she was reading a spreadsheet. But God, Mom, it felt like being seen. Do you understand 33 years and the first time I ever felt properly seen, it was a woman doing her job. And when I started finding the cracks, the calls, the crying, the folder part of me did exactly the math you did. I'm not stupid. I got there. He met my eyes. And another part of me thought if I don't look too closely, I get to keep being the man somebody chose. So I didn't look too closely. I told myself her nightmares weren't my business. I told myself the folder was private, which it was. That's the sick part. It was private. I could dress it up as respect. I got on the plane. He put his hand flat on the table between us. You kept a secret from me to protect me, he said. And I kept one from you to protect myself. And we've both been so busy managing each other that neither of us said one true sentence out loud until this morning, and by the time we got around to it, there's a man with a lien on my clinic. I reached across and took my son's hands in both of mine, and for a while neither of us said anything. There is a particular silence that falls between two people who have just stopped lying to each other. It is not comfortable. It is the opposite of comfortable. But it is clean, and we sat in it together until the kettle had gone entirely cold, and there were tires in the driveway. He was right, of course. Norman and I wrapped our son in a careful, loving secrecy his entire life, certain it would keep him safe, and what that secrecy actually produced was a man so unpracticed at being known that the first person who pretended to know him walked straight in through the front door and sat down. And Brock ashamed of an ordinary human loneliness, because his father's whole silent example had taught him that strong men do not have it built, a matching silence of his own. Two secrets side by side, each one kept out of love, and between them they held the door open and let Dana walk through it, and neither one was hers. Money is a tool, Norman used to say. So is silence. And we had both been using it as a weapon for years, mostly against ourselves. Patricia Hale is 71 and has practiced law in this county since 1979, and she has a way of listening with her pen down that makes you tell her more than you meant to. She came in at 8, took the chair Vance had sat in, and did not say a word for 11 minutes while I went through the legal pad line by line. When I finished, she picked up the 2 documents and read them both front to back twice. Then she took off her glasses. All right, she said. There are 3 separate things on this table, and I want to take them in order of how much they should frighten you. The competency thread is the least of it. That is Theater Beverly, and it is not even good theater. You are a retired RN with no diagnosis, no history, no incidents, and a $38 million portfolio that has outperformed its benchmark for 6 years, running under a licensed advisor with quarterly documentation. A guardianship petition against you would not survive its first hearing, and any attorney who filed it would be sanctioned. He said it because it costs nothing to say and it works on frightened people. It worked a little, and I don't blame you. The second is the demand itself. A son has no claim on a living parent's estate, and a daughter-in-law has no claim on yours through him, and no court in this state will hand any of them $1 of it. On that count you are untouchable, and you have been untouchable this entire time, and I wish very much you had called me in October. She tapped the promissory note. The third thing she said is real, and it is bad, and it is going to take up the next year of our lives. She read the number out loud, which somehow made it worse. $180,000 secured against the assets, receivables, equipment, and leasehold of Birchwood Animal Care. Is it enforceable, I asked. Patricia said partly. And that partly is where we live now. She explained it to me the way she explains everything, which is slowly and without any mercy. The note itself is a real debt. Brock received the money was spent, and no court is going to pretend otherwise. What is not real, or may not be, is the terms. 34% on a commercial note is above the ceiling in this state, absent a licensed lender exemption. So the entire question, the whole case, Beverly, is whether GM Vance Capital Holdings is a licensed lender. And is he, I asked. Patricia smiled with no warmth at all. I looked before I drove over. There is no GM Vance Capital Holdings registered as a lender in this state, or in the two adjacent ones. There is no consumer lender license, no sales finance license, nothing. There is an LLC formed 4 years ago with a registered agent that is a mailbox service in a strip mall. Which means what I said. Which means she said that a man who is not licensed to lend money at any rate lent money at 34% to a borrower he sourced through his own agent for a purpose he helped create secured by an operating business. And then came to that borrower's mother's living room to convert the debt into an equity demand against an unrelated estate. She put her glasses back on. That is not a gray area, Beverly. That is not aggressive lending. There are 4 or 5 separate names for what that is, and I intend to use all of them. Then she reached over and turned the photographs of the folder around the 9 pages. The false insurance rider, the durable power of attorney with Garrett M. Vance's name in the signature block. And these, she said, are the best thing anybody has done in this entire matter. I told her I had felt like a sneak photographing them under the good light, while Dana waited in the other room. Patricia said, Beverly, 90% of the people who come into my office in your situation have signed. They have signed, and they cannot prove they were told it was something else, and there is nothing I can do for them. You didn't sign, you kept a copy, and the copy has a date stamp. A document drafted to look like event insurance that in fact grants a third-party full authority over your finances presented for signature under a false description that is fraud in its plainest form, and it is fraud we can prove. Most people give me nothing to work with, she said. You gave me a case. I want to record what happened in my chest at that moment, because I have been hard on myself in this account, and I would like to be fair for one paragraph. For 6 months I had been a suspicious, secretive, difficult old woman who read documents she was told not to worry about and photographed them in her kitchen at 11 at night. It had cost me my son's trust, my oldest friendship, and a great deal of sleep, and had made me somebody I did not entirely like. And it turned out that of all the things I did in those 6 months, that the one thing I was most embarrassed about was the only thing that saved us. Not the silence. The silence cost us $180,000 and very nearly everything else. The suspicion saved us. I have not been able to draw a general rule out of that, and I have tried. The best I can do is be suspicious of documents and honest with people. I had it exactly backwards for 6 months. I was honest with the documents and suspicious of the people. For the next 9 days, Brock and I worked the way Norman used to work a bad account. Slowly, on paper. Nothing believed until it was confirmed twice. He moved back into his old bedroom, which neither of us discussed. Dana was in the apartment. He was not going back there. That was as far as either of us took it out loud in that first week. We put a card table in the study and we made files, and the files got labels because that is how Norman would have done it, and doing it his way was a way of having him in the room. Here is what we found. Garrett M. Vance held no lending license of any kind in any state we could reach. He had no securities registration, no insurance license, no CFP, no CPA. The phrase family financial advisor had been a costume he put on in my living room for 40 minutes. What he did have was an LLC and a pattern. Brock found the pattern first in the civil dockets, which are public and which almost nobody ever looks at. Over 11 years, GM Vance Capital Holdings and 2 predecessor entities had appeared as a party in 19 filings in 4 counties. Not one of them was a lawsuit against him by a borrower. They were all his liens, confessions of judgment, replevin actions, and 4 foreclosures. And when you laid the borrowers out side by side, they were the same person 19 times. A family-owned auto body shop whose owner had a wife with early-onset Parkinson's. A dairy farmer whose son had been in a car accident. A widow with a mortgage, and a grandson in a rehab facility that did not take her insurance. A man who ran a 2-truck landscaping outfit whose daughter had been born at 26 weeks. Every single one of them had a catastrophe with a bill attached to it, and every single one of them had run out of institutional options at exactly the moment Garrett Vance became reachable. He was not a loan shark in the sense that anybody in this town would picture. There were no threats of violence anywhere in any of it. He did not need them. His whole method was to find the moment when a decent person had one door left and to be standing in it well-dressed patient, sympathetic with paperwork. The rates ran from 29 to 41%. The terms were always structured with an acceleration clause on 2 consecutive missed payments, and in every one of the 19 filings the borrower had missed 2 consecutive payments, which is not a coincidence, which is a design. And then he took the thing, the shop, the equipment. In one case, a house, in another, 160 acres. I was careful. He was patient. He never went 1 inch past the line where the law would come and look at him properly. He was, I realized somewhere around the 4th night at that card table, precisely and exactly the kind of person my husband had spent 41 years telling me about. The wrong kind of person who comes to your door once it is known there is something inside worth taking. Brock said on the 5th night, he's not a crook mom, he's an industry. And then he found this Mercer file. It was the foreclosure notice on Walter and Carol Mercer's house on Delacroix Street, filed 16 weeks before the wedding, referenced in the county docket, like any other piece of ordinary municipal misery. Brock pulled up the lien holder, and we both stopped and looked at the screen and then at each other. GM Vance Capital Holdings, LLC. The same name that had sat in my living room 9 days earlier with my cream in his coffee, telling me he was the family's financial advisor. He had not come to my door as Dana's advisor. He had come as the man the Mercers owed. And I understood with a chill that started at the back of my neck and went all the way down that we had been looking at this thing from the wrong end since October. I had spent 6 months asking, what does Dana want from us? The question was, what does Garrett Vance want? And what is Dana to him? I called Ruth on the 10th day, and she picked up on the first ring, which told me she had been sitting near the phone for 11 days. Neither of us apologized for a while. I told her everything. The note, the lien, the 19 filings, the Mercer foreclosure, and Cody. Ruth listened without interrupting, and at the end she said leukemia. Yes. How old? 19. And then Ruth Caldwell, who I have known since 1984 and have seen cry twice, said nothing for a long time. I want to tell you what happened next, honestly, because it is the least flattering conversation in this story for both of us, and I have been tempted to leave it out. I said, Ruth, you told me not to tell him. And Ruth said, I know what I told you. And I said, you told me a secret kept never broke anybody. And I built 6 months on that sentence. And my son signed a $180,000 note because his mother told him in a parking lot that there was nothing behind him. And Ruth said very evenly, I told you not to tell the girl. I did tell you not to tell Brock, and I was wrong about that. And I will say so as many times as you need. But Beverly, I did not tell you to lie to your son's face. That was not in the advice. You'd have had to look for that. I did not say anything. You want me to have handed you a bad instruction so that the parking lot is my fault, she said, and a piece of it is mine and I'll carry it. But you were 68 years old and you made a choice with your mouth open and your eyes open, and if you put it on me, you will never actually look at it. I hung up on her for the 2nd time in 11 days. I called back 40 minutes later, and she picked up on the first ring again, and I said, you're right, and she said, I know, and then she said, I'm sorry about the boy. And then we both cried on the telephone like a pair of old fools. Then Ruth said the thing that actually mattered. I've been thinking about it for 11 days, she said, because I have nothing else to do. Beverly, 19 dockets, 11 years. He's very good, and he's never been touched. Do you know what that usually means? That he's careful, I said. It means he's never had a complaining witness, Ruth said. 22 years in compliance, I have never once seen a pattern like that broken by paperwork. Paperwork gets you a fine. What breaks a man like that is a person who will sit in a room and say what he did to her. She let that sit. You are not going to be that person, she said. You're a mark he approached one time and misjudged. Your son isn't either. He's a borrower who signed. The only person alive who can put Garrett Vance in a room is the girl. Which means what I said, though I already knew. Which means Ruth said that the woman you have spent 6 months learning to hate is the only door. I sat with that for 2 days, and I did not like it, and it did not go away. And then something happened that arranged the question for me. On a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the first visit, I came around the side of my house with a bucket in my hand, and Garrett Vance was standing in my back garden alone looking at the roses. There is no fence on the south side of my property. There never has been. Norman meant to put one up in about 1996. He was standing between the 2 big rose bushes with his hands in his pockets. No briefcase, no tie. A lighter jacket than before, looking at the blooms with what appeared to be actual interest. "Mrs. Bishop," he said without turning around. "These are Chrysler Imperials, aren't they? My mother grew these." I did not answer. My bucket was in my right hand, and I was calculating in an entirely animal way the distance to my back door and whether the phone was on the counter or in the study. "I'm not going to come any closer," he said, and he took 2 steps back toward the fence line and stopped. "And I'm not going to come inside. I'd like about 6 minutes, and then I'll go and you can call whoever you like when I'm gone. You'll want to anyway." "Say it from there," I said. He nodded as though I had been reasonable. "Your attorney has been making inquiries with the Division of Financial Regulation," he said. "That's fine. That's what she should do. I want to save everybody some months, so I'm going to tell you exactly what happens. They'll find the licensing issue. It's real. I'll get a cease and desist and a fine somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000, which I will pay. The rate on your son's note will very likely be reformed down to the statutory ceiling, and the interest already accrued will be credited to principal." He said this the way a man tells you the weather in a city he has lived in a long time. "What none of that touches," he said, "is the $180,000 of principal. He borrowed it. It went out of my account and into a caterer, a band, a bridal shop, and a photographer, and it is not coming back, and no regulator on earth is going to make a debt disappear because I filled out the wrong form 4 years ago. So at the end of a 9-month process and about $60,000 in legal fees, your son will owe me $180,000 at 11% instead of 34%, and he will still not have it, and the lien on that clinic will still be there." I stood in my own garden with a bucket in my hand and did not say anything because he was right, and because I had learned by then that when a man is telling you the truth about the parts that do not cost him anything, it is because he is about to lie about the part that does. He said, "I'd like to make you an offer that is much better than the one I made in your living room. $210,000, principal and the accrued to date, paid this week in full by you. I release the lien on Birchwood, I discharge the note, I take a wire, and I am gone from all of your lives forever, and neither of us ever has to see the inside of a courtroom." He let it sit. "You have $38 million, Mrs. Bishop. This is a rounding error to you. I am handing you the ability to make the entire thing stop on a Thursday afternoon for 0.2% of what you have. Now, I want you to understand how good that was because I did not for about 10 seconds. It was very good. Not the number, the architecture. $6 million in my living room had been outrageous. So outrageous that it made me stand up and call a lawyer. $210,000 was reasonable. $210,000 was the actual debt. It was the price of ending it, and there was no threat attached, and there was no advisor costume. And he had even conceded the licensing point up front, like an honest man. A woman who is frightened and tired and 11 days into a nightmare standing in her garden is very likely to pay $210,000 to make a Thursday stop. And the moment I paid it, there would be no borrower with a case no lien to complain about, no complaining witness, no regulator's file with anything in it but a licensing fine, and Garrett Vance would go on to number 20. The $6 million had never been the plan. The $6 million was the anchor. He had come into my living room and named an insulting number so that the real number when it arrived 11 days later in a garden with no briefcase would feel like relief. He had run the same play on me that he ran on 19 families with catastrophes. Be standing in the last door. Be well-dressed. Be sympathetic. Have paperwork. I said no. He was not surprised, which I did not care for. "Why not?" he said. And he asked it as though he genuinely wanted to know, and I think he did. And I said the truest thing I have said to anybody in this entire story. "Because you'd leave," I said. He tilted his head. "I said my husband told me for 41 years that if I kept us quiet, the wrong kind of person would never find us. He was wrong, as it happens. You found us anyway through a bathroom and a desk drawer. But the other half of what he said was that I'd know you when you came, and I do. And if I write you a wire on Thursday, then on Friday you will be in somebody else's garden telling somebody else's mother that it's a rounding error and she won't have $38 million. She'll have a house and a sick child. So no, not because I can't afford it, because I can. Garrett Vance looked at me for a while, and then he said something I have thought about more than anything else that was said in 11 months, and I want to set it down exactly. He said, "Mrs. Bishop, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm going to give you something for free because I think you've earned it, and because I don't expect it to change your mind. You believe I did this to your family. I didn't. I lent money to a woman's father in October at a rate he agreed to because no bank on this earth would lend to him, and he took it, and it kept his son in treatment for 4 more months, which is 4 months he would not otherwise have had. Everybody in this story keeps saying the word predator. Nobody has yet explained to me who else was standing in that room in October. Not the hospital. Not the insurer who denied it twice. Not the church. Not the neighbors who brought casseroles. And not you, Mrs. Bishop, with your $38 million and your quiet life 4 miles from that house. I was there. My terms are ugly. They're the terms of the only person who showed up." And then he picked a dead bloom off the nearest bush quite gently and dropped it and said, "You'll want to think I'm the reason that boy is dying. I'm the reason he's still alive in June. Both of those can be true. You seem like a woman who can hold 2 things." He walked back across the grass to the street and the Mercedes, and he was gone. I went inside and sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher for the 2nd time that spring. I want to be honest about what he did to me with that speech, because if I make him a cartoon, then none of this is any use to anybody. He was lying, and I knew he was lying, and it worked anyway. It was a lie because it left out everything. It left out that he had sent that man's daughter in his debt to work a charity gala and marry a stranger. It left out the 19 dockets and the acceleration clause that always triggered, and the 4 foreclosures. Whatever 4 months he bought that boy, he had already priced and intended to collect it 400 times over. A man who sets a house on fire and carries 1 child out is not a fireman. But the middle of it was true, and the middle of it went into me like a splinter, and it is still there. Not you, Mrs. Bishop, with your $38 million 4 miles from that house. In October, when Walter Mercer sat at his kitchen table and decided that a man at 41% was his best remaining option, I was in my house with $38 million and a folder system and a promise to Ruth Caldwell that I would not say a number out loud. I did not know. That is the defense, and it is a real one. But I want to ask why I did not know, and the answer is not that the information was unavailable. Carol Mercer tried to hand it to me on a velvet bench in a bridal shop with her hand on top of mine. A 19-year-old boy sat 2 feet from me in a room where I was the only trained clinician. Dana Mercer told me in my own kitchen that her family was in a difficult spot in those exact words, and I filed it as a technique. 3 doors, all open, and I walked past every one of them holding my cards close, being careful, being quiet, doing exactly what my husband had trained me to do for 41 years. Norman's rule kept the wrong kind of person out of my house for 4 decades. It also kept everybody else out. Dale Brooks came out to the house on a Monday, and I put the 11-page statement on the table in front of him, still in the manila folder marked Taxes 2023, still upside down. Dale is 62 and has managed our money since 1998 and cried at Norman's funeral in the 3rd pew. He went through his own security review in about 4 minutes and came out the other side gray. "There's no breach on my end, Beverly," he said. "There can't be. That document goes out once a year, printed in-house, mailed first class to one address." "I know," I said. "It didn't come from your office. It came from this drawer in October in 19 minutes while I dried dishes." And Dale Brooks put both hands over his face, which I have never seen him do, and said, "I mail you 11 pages with the address of every property and the annual yield on each one, on paper, to a house with a screen door." He changed it that week. Everything moved to an encrypted portal, and the annual statement stopped naming the properties. And Dale instituted a verbal callback protocol on any instruction bearing my name and a hold on any transfer over $10,000 until he had spoken to me and to Patricia both. "Should have been that way in 2019, he said from the door. "It should have been." But I want to say the thing that nobody said in my kitchen that day, which is that the protocol he built in one afternoon was not complicated or expensive or new. It is what every institution in the country does as a matter of course. We did not have it because we were quiet people who kept our money in a wooden drawer and believed that being unremarkable was a security system. It is not. It is a hope. We called Dana on a Tuesday evening. Brock made the call himself. I listened from the other side of the room, and his voice was steadier than I expected, and he said only that there were family financial matters to discuss, and asked her to come to the house the next afternoon at 2. I heard the eagerness come up in her voice even through the phone, the assumption that the old woman had finally cracked, and I felt something I did not expect, which was pity because she had no idea she was walking toward the end of the only plan she had. She came in her own car, a 9-year-old Corolla with a cracked mirror housing, not the Mercedes. I noted that, and I understood 2 things from it. Vance had not come, and she had not told him she was coming. She walked into my living room with the brittle confidence of a woman prepared to negotiate, saw Patricia Hale sitting in the corner chair with a legal pad, and faltered for half a second before she got the smile back on. "Brock," she said, going toward him, reaching for his hand. "Darling, what is all this? Is your mother giving you trouble about us again?" He stepped back from her hand, gently. That was the thing that undid her more than anything else that afternoon. I think not the lawyer in the corner, but that he moved out of reach and did it kindly. "Sit down, Dana," he said. "We need to talk." She gave the performance of her life for about 11 minutes. When Brock described the demand at my door, she pressed her fingertips to her lips and said she had been so worried about me, that Garrett was an old friend of her father's who had offered to help and had gotten carried away, that the whole thing had been a terrible misunderstanding, and she had been mortified. When I described the folder, she said it had only ever been the insurance rider, that the coordinator had assembled it, that I must have been confused, and this was very good, that she blamed herself for not sitting with me while I read it. Tears came up in her eyes on cue. Beautifully. I will admit they were convincing, and if I had not spent 31 years across tables from people performing their innocence, I might have taken them. But I had, and she was good, and she was not better than 3 decades of practice. I waited until she stopped for breath. Then I said, "A wife who married for love does not bring an unlicensed lender to her mother-in-law's house 5 days after the wedding to ask for $6 million. The room went very still. Her eyes went to Patricia, then to Brock, then back to me. I watched her recalculate. You could see it happen. It is not a comfortable thing to watch on a person's face. And it was Brock who ended it. He took out his phone, set it on the coffee table, and turned the screen toward her. Because we had the messages by then. She and Brock had still been on a shared account, and the account had a web portal, and the web portal had a backup, and there they were. He read one out loud in a flat, careful voice, and he did not look up while he read it. "You marry the vet, you get the family money, you clear your father's balance, and we're square. Simple as that. Don't overthink it." Then he looked at her. "I know about Cody," he said, and his voice broke just slightly on the name. "I know about the relapse and the house and the denial letter and what your father borrowed and who he borrowed it from. I found the folder in the safe in Santorini. I've known since the second night of our honeymoon, Dana. I got on the plane knowing. So you can stop now." The performance held for one more second, one more flicker of a woman about to say, "I don't know what you mean," and then it went all at once the way a tent goes when you pull the last stake. The crying that came next was nothing like the first kind. It was ugly and almost silent, and she put both hands flat over her face like a child. When she could talk, her voice was so small I had to lean toward her. "I was going to take the house," she said, "with Cody still in it. There's a hospital bed in the dining room because he can't do the stairs. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He can't do the stairs. And Garrett said if the payments stopped, he'd foreclose, and I would have done anything to keep my brother from being moved out of that house to die somewhere worse." Nobody said anything for a while, and then she lowered her hands and looked at my son, and what came out of her next was the thing I had not seen coming. "The plan was never supposed to include this," she said. I screened you at the gala. That part is exactly what you think. I knew what your family was worth before I knew the color of your eyes, and I could have told you the annual yield on the Galesburg property before I could have told you your middle name. But somewhere in the middle of it I stopped pretending. I can't even point to when. And I didn't tell anyone because I was so ashamed, and because by then there was no version where I got to have it. She said I ruined the one real thing in the worst year of my life with my own 2 hands. And I know you'll never believe that, and I don't blame you, and I wouldn't believe me either. I fell in love with you for real, Brock. And I found out too late to do anything but destroy it. It hung in my living room, and nobody moved to fill the space after it. Brock sat very still looking at the woman he had married, and I could see him trying to decide whether to believe her, and I could see very clearly how badly a part of him wanted to. Patricia in the corner chair watched all of it with the unreadable patience of a woman who has learned that the most important thing in a room is usually the thing nobody has said, and she was right as it turned out. Because there was one more thing, and it was sitting on the coffee table in front of us the entire time, and we did not see it for another 4 days. Patricia's paralegal pulled the recorded documents on the Delacroix Street property on a Friday, and Patricia called me before she had finished reading them. "Beverly," she said, "sit down. The October note on the Mercer house is not Walter Mercer's." I heard the words and did not understand them. "The mortgage is his," she said. "From the bank from 2004, that's ordinary. The second position, the note to Vance, the one with the 41% on it, the one the foreclosure is being run under, is signed by Dana R. Mercer. Individually, she is the borrower. She pledged her parents' house, which she could do because Walter put her on the deed as a joint tenant in 2016, which people do all the time, so their kids can avoid probate." I sat down. "Say the rest," I said, because I could hear that there was rest. "The rest," Patricia said, "is that Walter and Carol Mercer's signatures do not appear anywhere on it," which means either they consented and stayed off the paper, which is possible, or I said, "or they don't know," she said. "Brock drove to Delacroix Street that evening and did not tell me he was going, and I found out because he called me from his car afterward, parked 3 houses down, and I could hear that he had been sitting there a while. He had not gone in. He had gotten as far as the front walk and seen through the window that Carol Mercer was setting a tray down next to a hospital bed in what used to be the dining room, and he had turned around and gone back to the car. "Mom," he said, "they don't know." "How can you tell? Because if Walter Mercer knew his daughter had put his house up at 41% to keep his son alive, he would not be able to sit in that living room," he said. "And he's sitting in that living room watching a ball game with a beer." Then he said she went to Vance in October. Herself. Nobody sent her. Yes. She's the borrower. Everything after that, the galamy all of it, that's her trying to get out of a hole she dug on purpose. "Yes," I said. There was a long silence on the phone. Then my son said, "I've spent 2 weeks getting ready to feel sorry for a woman who was sent. And now she's a woman who went." And I said the only thing I had, which was she went in October, sweetheart, to save her brother without telling her parents, because she thought she could carry it alone. And he said, "I know. That's what's killing me. That's the most sympathetic thing anybody's done in this entire story. And it's also the thing that put a man in your living room." That was the 3rd floor dropping out, and it did not make Dana better or worse. It made her larger. She had not been a woman handed a task by a man who owned her. She had been a woman who at 29 years old sat down at a kitchen table with a sick brother upstairs and a denial letter in her hand, and made a decision that no one else in her family knew about, and signed it alone, and then spent 7 months paying for it in a currency she had not known she would be asked for. She was not innocent. She was the author of it, and she was at the same time the only person in the Mercer family who had done anything at all. I have never been able to make those settle. I have stopped trying. It was Ruth who found Eileen Voss, and Ruth found her the way Ruth finds everything, which is by reading something that nobody else can be bothered to read. Among the 19 filings, there was one that did not fit. Every other case had ended the same way: default acceleration judgment collection. One had ended with a voluntary dismissal filed by Vance's own counsel 11 days after it was opened 3 years ago in a county about 90 minutes north. "Nobody voluntarily dismisses," Ruth said. "Not a man like that. He had a judgment in the bag and he walked away from it. That is the single most interesting piece of paper in this entire mess, and neither of you looked at it because it's boring." The defendant was Eileen Voss, 74, of Hartwell. I called her. I told her who I was and why I was calling, and I got about 11 words in before she said very quietly, "Is he doing it to somebody else?" I said yes. She said, "Come up." Not on the phone. Eileen Voss lived in a yellow house with a porch that needed painting and a very old dog named Bruno, who came to the door with her. She had lost her husband in 2019. Her grandson had been living with her since he was 14, and at 19 he had gone into a residential treatment program that her insurance covered for 28 days, and that he had needed for 180. She had gone to 2 banks and a credit union, and then at a fundraising luncheon for the treatment center. She said that phrase, and I put my cup down. A young woman from the foundation had sat down next to her and been so kind and had asked such good questions and had said at the end in the parking lot that her family knew somebody who did private lending, and it wasn't a bank, and the rate was ugly, but it was money on a Tuesday. She signed for $140,000 against her house at 38%. Was the young woman's name Dana? I asked. Eileen Voss said she called herself Diana Marsh. I sat in that living room with an old dog's chin on my shoe and had to concentrate on breathing. Because there it was, 3 years before the gala, before Cody relapsed, before any of it. Dana Mercer had worked for Garrett Vance as his scout in the exact professional costume she wore for the rest of her life, a development officer at a charity event finding the person in the room with an asset in a catastrophe. She had not been sent to my son as a first-time offender under duress. She had been very, very good at this for years before she ever owed him $1. I asked Eileen Voss how it ended, and this is why I drove 90 minutes, and this is why I am telling you any of this. She said 3 days before the redemption period ran out, Diana Marsh knocked on that door and stood right where you're sitting and told me who she was and who he was and what he was going to do. Eileen Voss folded her hands. She said I couldn't stop it. She said go tomorrow before 9 to a legal aid office in Bloomington, ask for a woman named Renata, tell her the rate and the date, and show her the second page. She said it 3 times to make sure I had it. And then she said, I'm sorry, ma'am, and she went and sat in her car in front of my house for about 20 minutes before she drove off. I went to Bloomington in the morning. Renata looked at page 2 and said the rate was over the line and the entity wasn't licensed, and told me not to pay another cent and to answer nothing. 11 days later, it was dismissed. I still live here. She looked around her front room. I still live here, she said again, because I don't think she believed it either. I asked, did you ever hear from her again? Eileen Voss said no. And then she said, I wrote to the address on the loan papers once to say thank you. I never got an answer. I've always wondered whether she got in trouble for it. She did get in trouble for it. We worked it out afterward, Patricia and Brock and I, from the dates, and it is not complicated once you have the shape. 3 years ago, Dana Mercer blew up a $140,000 collection 11 days from judgment, and Garrett Vance lost the house, the judgment, and the fees. He did not have her charged because he could not. Everything she had done for him was as unlicensed as everything he had done himself. He did something better. He put the loss on her books. She started October of last year at his door already carrying it, and that is why her father's roof went up at 41%, and that is why she got on a plane to no honeymoon, and that is why on a bathroom floor in Santorini at 3 in the morning, she was whispering to a man she had been trying to get away from for 3 years. She had not been a hostage from the beginning. She had walked in the front door at 26 with her eyes open and done real harm to real people for money. And then once she had not been able to finish it. And the price of the one decent thing she ever did for a stranger was the debt that eventually put a man in my living room. I drove home that night on the state highway with the windows down, and I said out loud to nobody twice, she does this, and then she can't finish it. Which meant she had not finished with us either. Which meant that something had happened on that island on the second to last day that we had all read as a work emergency. I did not have it yet. But I had the shape of it, and the shape kept me up until 4 in the morning. I went to Delacroix Street alone on a Saturday morning against the advice of my attorney, my son, and Ruth Caldwell, all 3 of whom told me it was a mistake, and one of whom was correct that it was. Patricia wanted the next conversation with Dana to be on her terms. Recorded scheduled counsel present, nothing said that could later be characterized as an inducement. And I told her she could have all of that, and she could have it the following week. But first I wanted one conversation where I sat across a table from that girl and looked at her and found out what was actually in there. Not because I am soft, because I spent 31 years learning the difference between a person who is rotten and a person who did a rotten thing, and I was not willing to help end somebody's life without knowing which one I was ending. Carol Mercer opened the door. She had a dish towel in her hand, and she looked at me for a second without any idea who I was in the way of a woman who has not slept properly in a year, and then she knew me and her hand went to her mouth. Oh, she said. Oh, Beverly. Is everything I said, Carol. I've come to talk to Dana. And I'd like to say hello to Cody if he's up to it. The bed was in the dining room under the good window, and there was a folding table beside it with a plastic tumbler and a basin and a book about the ocean. Cody Mercer was 19 and gray and about 11 pounds lighter than he had been in his suit at the rehearsal dinner, and when I walked in he said, "Hey, you're the mom." I sat down in the chair by the bed. I did not ask him about his sister, and I did not ask him about money. I asked him where his line was, and he told me right subclavian, and I asked what they had him on, and he rattled it off in the flat, bored way that 19-year-olds do when they have learned 4 drug names properly, and I asked whether the mouth sores were the worst of it, and he said, God, yes. Nobody warns you about that. Everybody warns you about the hair. We talked for about 20 minutes. At one point he said, "Are you a nurse or something?" I said 31 years. And he said, "Oh, thank God." And then he asked me a question about what his counts meant. An actual clinical question, a real one that he had clearly been carrying around for weeks and had not asked anybody because his mother would cry and his father would go out to the garage. I answered it. Honestly, in plain language with the parts that were bad included. He listened and he nodded and he said, "Okay. Okay, thanks." That is all it was. 20 minutes and one straight answer. And I sat there afterward with my hands in my lap and thought about that boy sitting alone at a table at a rehearsal dinner 2 feet from me with the one person in the room who knew how to talk to him. And I thought about all the reasons I had for walking away with my wine. I had 6 months of extremely good reasons. Every single one of them was correct. Together they had made me a woman who could not tell a dying child from a maneuver. Dana was standing in the kitchen doorway. I do not know how long she had been there. Her face was doing something I had not seen it do, which was nothing at all. We went out to the back steps because there was nowhere in that house to talk. I said, "I've been to Hartwell." She sat down on the step like her legs had gone. "I met Eileen Voss," I said. "And Bruno." Dana Mercer put her forehead on her knees and stayed there. "And I said, I want to hear it from you, and I will know if you shape it, so don't." She told me all of it on the back steps in about 40 minutes, and I have never heard anybody talk like that before or since. It came out flat and fast without any of the music she normally put in her voice. She met Vance at 26 through a man she was seeing. She was making $39,000 a year at a foundation and had $11,000 in student debt, and he offered her $400 for an introduction, then $800, then a percentage. She said, "I want to be clear that I was not desperate when I started." That's the part people want, and it isn't true. I was ambitious, and I was broke in a completely ordinary way, and it was easy, and I was good at it, and I told myself I was matching people who needed money with somebody who would give them money, which is a sentence I could say out loud for about 2 years. She did it for 4 years. 11 introductions. She named them. She had them in order, which told me something about what her nights were like. And then Eileen Voss, she said, who had a dog and a grandson, and gave me a butterscotch out of the dish and asked me if I was eating enough. She said I don't have a good story about why her. I've tried to build one. It wasn't a change of heart, it was more like I got tired in the wrong second. Vance put the $140,000 on her, plus fees. Plus she said a number that went up whenever he wanted it to, which is the actual mechanism in the end, not a contract. A figure a man keeps in his head. She had been paying him for 3 years. She had stopped permanently being able to see a way out. And then in November, her brother relapsed, and the insurer denied the trial protocol twice, and her father sat at his kitchen table with a pen and no options, and she thought, "I already know a man." I did it to save Cody, she said. And I also did it because after 3 years of paying Garrett Vance, going to him felt like going to the bank. That is what I actually want you to understand, Mrs. Bishop, because everybody keeps handing me the sympathetic version, and I would rather have the true one. It was not a desperate act. It was a familiar one. Then I asked her about Santorini. She was quiet a long time. She said I told him I wasn't going to do it. The 41-minute call, I said, "Yes, tell me." She said I told him the wedding was done and it was as far as I could go, that I would pay him myself forever whatever he wanted, but that I was not going to ask Brock's mother for money, and I was not going to have him anywhere near her. And what did he say? She said he told me he'd send the file to Brock, the whole thing. Hartwell, the 11 introductions, the note on my parents' house. He said, "Do you want your husband of 4 days to hear it from you or from me?" And then he said he'd be at your house on Thursday either way, and I could be in the car or not. So I got in the car, she said. I got in the car so I could be in the room. That is the entire reason. And then I sat in your living room and let him say what he said. And I said the thing about hoarding, and I said the thing about losing your son, because if I'd sat there like a woman being marched in, he would have known. She looked up at me for the first time. "I'm not telling you that to be forgiven. I understood on the plane that there wasn't going to be any forgiving. I'm telling you because you asked, and because I'm done being good at talking." Here is the part I have not been able to explain to anybody, including Patricia, including my son. I believed her. Not all of it. Not because she was convincing. By then she was not convincing at all. She was terrible at it, which is how I knew. I believed her because of Eileen Voss's front room and a woman driving 90 minutes to blow up her own collection and then sitting in her car outside the house for 20 minutes afterward. Twice now she had done the whole ugly thing beautifully all the way to the last week and then failed at the end. Not from goodness exactly, from something more like an inability to complete emotion. I have thought about that a great deal, and the closest I can get is this: she was not a good person who did bad things, and she was not a bad person with one soft spot. She was a person who had learned a skill in her 20s before she understood what it cost, and who had gotten very good at it, and who could not stop, and who could also not, when it came down to the last 3 days, finish. That is not redemption. You do not get to sell a thing 11 times and be redeemed by flinching twice. But it is not nothing either. Eileen Voss still lives in that yellow house. That is a fact in the world, and Dana Mercer put it there, and it cost her 3 years. I said on those back steps the only thing I have ever said to her, that I still stand behind entirely. Nobody is going to fix this for you. Not me, and not my son, and you have burned the one man who would have. But I am going to go after Garrett Vance, and I am going to need somebody who will sit in a room and say out loud what he did, and there is exactly one person on this earth who can. She said they'll charge me too. I said yes, they will. And she said after a while, okay, that is all. She said okay on her parents' back steps with her brother's window open above us. It was in the days after that I found the second letter. Patricia needed the original estate documents for the filings, and those were not in the house. They were in a safe deposit box at the bank downtown, a box I had been given the key to 18 months earlier and had never once opened because some part of me was not prepared to go through the last private drawer of my husband's life. A young teller walked me down to the vault on a Tuesday morning and left me alone in one of those little rooms with no window and a chair. Everything was in order. The deed, the trust instruments, the policies, the original bill of sale from 2019 with Norman's signature on it in his awful cramped hand. And underneath all of it, an envelope with my name on it. He had written it 14 months before he got sick. He told me a story he had carried our entire marriage and never told me whole. When Norman was a boy, his family had not been poor. His father had built a small lumber and millwork business in Michigan, nothing enormous, 11 employees at its best, and they had been comfortable. There had been a second car. There had been talk of college for both boys, and then a man came into their lives. He wrote it plainly without adjectives, which is how I know how much it cost him. The man presented himself as a friend and then as an investor. He was patient. He came to dinner. He remembered the names of the children and the date of my grandmother's operation, Norman wrote. It took him a little over 2 years to be trusted completely and about 9 weeks to take everything. He drained the operating accounts and left with the receivables and left behind $81,000 of debt in the company's name that Norman's father had personally guaranteed and had not fully understood he was guaranteeing. That was why Norman's father broke down. That is why a boy of 19 left school and went to work in a hardware store and then drove a second-hand truck with a bad transmission. Not because they had always been poor, because a smiling man had made them poor, and Norman had watched it happen from a kitchen doorway at 13 years old, and had not been able to do one single thing about it. Then he wrote this, and I am going to give it to you in his words as near as I can, because I have read that page enough times to have it. I never told you because I did not want that man living in our marriage, but I want you to understand why I was the way I was about money. It was never greed, and it was never fear of spending. It was that I have known since I was 13 exactly what kind of person comes for a family that lets it be known there is something to take. Keep us quiet, Bev. Keep our boy from learning it the way I learned it. And if someone ever does come for what we built, you will know him because he will smile at you exactly the way that man smiled at my father. I sat in that little windowless room and wept, and not only for grief. Every coupon, every sensible car. The day and a half he did not speak to me because I called it a small mind about money. 41 years of a man saying the same sentence to me at the kitchen sink, and I had heard it 41 years running as a personality trait. He was not being careful. He was standing watch. And a smiling man did come exactly as he said, and I did know him. That part is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. When Garrett Vance stood in my garden and told me it was a rounding error, I knew him on sight, and I knew him because of Norman. But I need to say the rest because if I stop the letter there, it becomes a story about a wise husband whose advice saved us, and that is not the story. Norman's warning had 2 halves. Keep us quiet, and you will know him when he comes. The second half saved us. The first half is what let him get all the way to my living room before I ever saw his face. Quiet is not a defense. Quiet is a delay. It buys you years, and then it hands you a single afternoon in which everything depends on one old woman's judgment, and it takes away every ordinary safeguard that talkative people have. the second opinion. The friend who says that sounds strange to me. The son who knows what his family has and cannot be told a lie about it in a parking lot. My husband was 13 years old in a kitchen doorway, and he learned the wrong lesson from the worst thing that ever happened to him, and he taught it to me for 41 years and to our son for 33. And we both believed it because he was a good man and we loved him, and because it was for most of that time indistinguishable from working. I do not blame him. He was a boy. He built us a life out of what he had, and he was standing watch the whole time. And on the last afternoon of his usefulness, he was 18 months dead and I was the only one at the window. But I am 69 years old and I am not 13, and I am allowed to take the half that works and put the other half down. I will not pretend the ending was cinematic, because it was not. It was 11 months of paper. Patricia assembled everything: the 19 dockets, the licensing records, the note against Birchwood, the photographs of the false power of attorney, with its date stamp, the recorded second position on Delacroix Street, and eventually the sworn statement of Eileen Voss of Hartwell, who drove down twice and brought her own pen. She handed it to the Division of Financial Regulation and to an assistant state's attorney named Okonkwo, who read the whole file over a weekend and called Patricia on a Sunday night. Dana Mercer sat in a room for 11 hours across 2 days and told them all of it. The 11 introductions in order, the structure, the way the numbers moved, the acceleration clauses, the standing arrangement. She had documents. She had, it turned out, kept everything for 4 years, which is the behavior of a person who has always known how it ends. She was charged. I want that on the record because people hear this story and assume that a woman who cooperates walks away. She pleaded to 2 felonies. She lost any ability to work in nonprofit development for the rest of her life. She is on a restitution order she will be paying when she is 60. She served 8 months. Garrett Vance was indicted on 19 counts spanning unlicensed lending, criminal usury, and a fraud count arising from the 9-page folder he drafted with his own name in the signature block, which Patricia used to say with enormous satisfaction was the stupidest thing an intelligent man ever did. He took a plea in the end: 41 months forfeiture and a permanent bar. 4 of the 19 liens were unwound, and 2 of the foreclosures reopened, and Eileen Voss got a letter from the state that she framed. I saw him one more time in a hallway outside a courtroom in February, and he had aged the way men do when the tailoring stops. He looked at me for a second, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing either of us needed from the other, and that is the actual end of Garrett Vance in my life. I want to say one thing about him that nobody enjoys. He was not caught by cleverness, and he was not caught by justice. He operated for 11 years in plain sight, filing public documents in public courthouses, and every fact anybody needed was sitting in a docket the whole time. He was caught because one of the 19 families had a lawyer on retainer $38 million and a retired nurse with nothing but time. The other 18 had exactly the same evidence available to them and no way on earth to use it. The note on Birchwood was reformed and then partly discharged, and then in the end there was still $180,000 of real principal that a real man had really borrowed. Brock insisted on paying it, all of it himself over 4 years at a legitimate rate from an actual credit union. He also lost the building. That is the part I would take back if I could take back one thing. The lien had frozen him at exactly the moment his 10-year lease came up, and the landlord did not want the complication, and Birchwood Animal Care moved in November into a smaller place on Route 9 with worse parking and 1 exam room fewer. I offered. Of course I offered. I offered to write a check that afternoon, and I offered every month for 6 months. And he said no, and he kept saying no, and one night in September he said, "Mom, you have to let me have this." I said I was trying to help. And he said, "I know. But the last time you decided what I could handle without asking me, I signed a note at 34%. So you're going to ask me now, and I'm going to say no, and you're going to hear it." He was right. He is right about most things now, my son. It is one of the more uncomfortable outcomes of all this. The marriage was annulled on grounds of fraud in the inducement, which took 9 months and cost more than it should have. Brock did not fight for anything, and neither did she. I did 2 things that year that Norman would not have done, and I want to set them both down plainly. The first is that I sold Galesburg. I did not have to. Nobody made me. But the legal fees ran past $200,000 by the following spring, and I wanted every dollar of the response funded out of a property rather than out of the portfolio, because it made it real to me in a way that a line in a statement never would have. I sold it in a hurry in a bad quarter to the first serious buyer, and Dale Brooks told me twice that if I waited 8 months, I would do considerably better. I did not wait. It was the most expensive, purely emotional decision of my life, and I would make it again. The second is that I paid for Cody Mercer's treatment, and I did not do it anonymously. I want to explain that because my first plan was anonymous. I had it worked out with Dale and Patricia, no name on anything, no path back to me. I liked that plan enormously. It was quiet, it was clean, and it let me be generous without being known. And it took me about 3 weeks to understand that I had designed one more time the exact same instrument that had cost us everything. So I drove to Delacroix Street and sat in the chair beside the bed and told a 19-year-old boy that a woman he barely knew was going to cover his treatment, and that his parents' house was not going to be taken, and that he could ask me whatever he wanted about it, and I would answer. He asked me 2 questions. The first was, "Is this because of my sister?" I said no. "It is in spite of your sister. It is because you are 19 and you did nothing to anybody." The second was, "Do I have to be grateful?" And I said no. "But you do have to let me look at your chart." He is 20 now. He got into a trial protocol in October, and he is in remission. And remission at 20 after a relapse is not a promise. And he and I both know exactly what it is and is not, because I gave him the honest version the first day, and he has never once let me get away with less since. He calls me on Sundays. He calls me Bev, which nobody but Norman and Ruth has ever done. Dana I never forgave and never condemned, and I have made my peace with living in the middle of that, because 11 months taught me the middle is where nearly everybody actually lives. She wrote to Brock twice from Logan, and he did not answer either letter, and I told him that was his to decide, and I meant it. She wrote to me once, a short one, and it did not ask for anything. She got out in March. She works in a warehouse office in her uncle's business 2 states away on the restitution order, and she sends money to her parents every month. And Carol Mercer told me on the phone that she comes home for 2 days at Christmas and sleeps in her old room and hardly speaks. I do not know what to want for her. I have tried on several different things and none of them fit. Ruth says I should want nothing for her at all, and that this is a moral failing in me, and Ruth may be right. She frequently is, and she has also never sat on a back step and listened to somebody name 11 strangers in order. Ruth and I are fine, better than fine. We had it out properly the following summer over 2 days and a bottle of something, and there is now a rule between us, which is that neither of us is permitted to give the other advice that costs nothing. Dale Brooks put in the callback protocol in the portal and a security review every August, and he has never once let me thank him for it, because he regards the whole thing as a debt he owes Norman. Patricia Hale retired in June and did not tell me until the file was closed, which is exactly like her. A year and change after the wedding that the law says never happened, I sat on my porch with my son on a cool autumn evening and watched the light go gold over the roses. The practice on Route 9 is smaller, and it is doing fine. He started teaching 1 evening a month at a financial literacy program at the community college an hour, on reading a promissory note which he does with an overhead projector, and his own note from the front page to the acceleration clause with his name on it in front of 30 strangers. I asked him once whether that was hard. He said the first time. Now it's the most useful hour I spend all month, and he has begun slowly to see somebody. Her name is Hannah Wells, and she teaches special education and drives a 14-year-old Corolla with a cracked taillight. She keeps meaning to fix, and the first time he brought her to dinner, she spent the whole evening asking me about Norman, not the business or the sale, but the man, what made him laugh, how we met, whether he was a good dancer, which he was not. Afterward, walking me to my car, Brock said I told her about the money. I stopped. Everything he said. The $38 million, Dad, all of it on the 4th date, before I knew whether I even liked her. Why so early, I said. And my son said, because I'm not doing the other thing anymore, Mom. I did the other thing, and it cost me a building. Then he grinned, and it was the open, steady grin of the boy I raised handed back to me at last. If she's a Dana, he said, I'd rather find out on the 4th date than the 4th year. And if she isn't, then she gets to know me with the whole thing on the table, which is the only way anybody's ever going to. I am 69 years old, and I did not expect to learn anything new at this age. I learned that a secret is not always a wall between people, but it is never only a shield either. It works on whoever is standing nearest, and half the time that is the person you meant to protect. I learned that instinct is very good at telling you where to look and completely useless at telling you what you are looking at, and that 6 months of being right about the facts made me wrong about a boy in a suit 2 feet away from me. I learned that the worst person in a story and the most desperate person in it are sometimes the same person, and that you can hold both of those without letting either one off the hook, though it is uncomfortable and nobody will thank you for it. And I learned that the man I loved for 41 years was standing watch the entire time from the age of 13, and that he was right about the smiling stranger and wrong about the quiet, and that loving somebody properly at the end includes being willing to take the half of their wisdom that was fear and set it down. The 38 million is still there less what Galesburg went for growing quietly under Dale's careful hands. Its value was never in the number. It is in a scholarship in Norman Bishop's name that sends the children of long-haul drivers to school, which has his name on it in public on a plaque in a building where anybody can read it. It is in a yellow house in Hartwell with a porch that has now been painted. And it is in a boy of 20 who calls me on Sundays and calls me Bev. Have you ever kept a secret to protect somebody you love? I would like to know how it went. Mine kept a stranger out of my house for 40 years, and then it opened the door for him, and I have spent a year working